improve your EBSD data indexing results. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have a question, please submit it through the questions pane on your console. Any issues regarding connectivity and workshop viewing will be addressed immediately. We will attempt to answer any questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. If we do not get to your question, we will follow up via email after the workshop. Now I'd like to introduce the speaker for today's workshop. Matt Nell is the EBSD product manager at Gatan EDAX and has a passion for EBSD and microstructural characterization. Matt joined TechSem Labs, known as TSL, upon graduation from the University of Utah in 1995 with a degree in materials science and engineering. At TSL, he was part of the team that pioneered the development and commercialization of EBSD and OIM. After EDAX acquired TSL in 1999, he joined the applications group to help continue to develop EBSD as a technique and integrate structural information with chemical information collected using EDS. Within EDAX, Matt has held several roles, including product management, business development, customer and technical support, engineering, and application support and development. Matt has published over 100 papers in a variety of application areas. He greatly enjoys the opportunity to interact with scientists, engineers, and microscopists to help expand the role that EBSD plays in materials characterization. In his spare time, Matt enjoys playing golf and pondering if changing the texture of his clubs will affect his final score. Over to Matt.
All right, thanks. It always makes me laugh, Jonathan. Thanks. Welcome, everyone, both in person and remotely. This is a fun workshop we're doing. First, I'd like to thank CEMAS here at The Ohio State University for the invitation to be here as part of their 10th anniversary celebration. So we have a hybrid presentation going on where we're doing some of it. We have an in-person session, and we're also broadcasting this on this webinar. So thanks, everyone, for attending. It's a little bit different schedule because of this. I'm going to start with this presentation. We'll take a little bit of a coffee break, but we'll keep the online broadcast going. And then after 15 minutes or so, we'll resume, and we're going to do some hands-on analysis of data sets that have been submitted to show how spherical indexing works and what we can learn from the improvements on the samples. As far as my presentation, I'm going to do a brief introduction to EBSD, just an overview, and kind of focusing on traditional hough indexing, how it works, and where it starts to break down. And that will lead to how we can do improvements to hough indexing using dictionary and spherical indexing, and some of the improvements we get through what we call orientation refinement. I also want to acknowledge my coworkers, Stuart Wright, Will Lenthy, and Renee Duclos. Kind of compiled work that's based on work that we've all done together. I'd also like to mention that CEMAS here in Columbus, Ohio, has a masterclass in SEM work. That's something that will be coming up here in a few months. You can get more information here at this link. This has two components here where there's going to be some online lectures available starting at the beginning of April, and then a couple of hands-on sessions later in the month. So this is a really nice class where you learn about SEM, EDS, EBSD, and also have the opportunity to come here to the lab and get some hands-on experience with the equipment. So it's a really nice course that's available through CEMAS to learn more about this technology. So EBSD, if you're not familiar with this technique, this is a SEM-based characterization technique to look at the crystal orientation and phase of materials. So this is a little schematic here of an EBSD detector. Oh, let me click that button. Where turn on my pointer. You can see it. We tilt the sample around 70 degrees. We fire the electron beam at it. The beam interacts with the sample and diffracts and goes towards the detector. That image is then captured into a computer for what we call indexing, which is the determination of the crystal orientation for that given pattern. The bands in this diffraction pattern represent different crystallographic planes in the material that are diffracting, and the arrangement of those planes or those bands represent the orientation and phase. So So that's EBSD in a quick nutshell. And the most common application for EBSD is something that you'll hear called EBSD mapping, but we've also termed it orientation imaging microscopy. So we basically have our computer talking to the SEM, talking to the EBSD detector and to the EDS detector. We determine our analysis area of interest. So this can range from nanometers to centimeters if you montage fields together. But we determine the area we want to sample from. And then we determine a step size. How often do we want to sample the analysis surface and collect a pattern? And at each point, we collect the pattern, we do some processing, and we determine the crystal orientation. So I'm showing that here with a little unit cell representation, but we represent it numerically. These are 3 Euler angles. And as we do this, we also record a number of other scalar parameters to things like what's the pattern quality, what's our confidence in the solution, what's the signal intensity on different parts of the detector that can help build sort of the data matrix that's available from each individual diffraction pattern. And so once we have this, we can start to generate different types of output. So the most common is an orientation map or an inverse pole figure map. And basically with this, each point that we've collected is shaded according to a crystallographic orientation. And generally when we do this with an inverse pole figure map, we show this little reference stereographic triangle. We color things here. So if it's an 001 orientation, it's shaded red. If it's a 111, it's shaded blue. It's important to note for these IPF maps that this is relative to a given sample direction. So most commonly, we're showing this map relative to the surface normal direction of a sample. But you can also say, I want to look down the rolling direction or the transverse direction, or really any vector in physical space. You can define that. All the maps I'll show today are just relative to the surface normal direction. But it's important that when you show this, often you want to reference what sample reference frame you're showing this orientation relative to. And then the other thing that's pretty common is to look at a grain boundary map. So we know the orientation of each point. We're able to calculate the misorientation or disorientation between those and shade boundaries based on what's the crystallographic difference between those points. So this is just showing in this microstructure a range from 5 degrees to 63 degrees, and the colors will represent certain boundaries. And in certain types of microstructure, there are preferred boundaries. Like in nickel superalloys, you'll see twin boundaries that have a very specific misorientation. So you'll see these 60-degree boundaries. You can identify those as twins, but you can sometimes have phase transformations that will have a fingerprint of a given misorientation. So it's a very good technique for looking at misorientations over a large number of grains. The other thing I want to point out, and we'll talk about later, is sort of the low end. What's the precision of this technique? How fine of a change of misorientation we can detect? With Hough transforms, we'll say anywhere from 1/10 of a degree to 1/2 a degree, depending on pattern quality. As we start talking about spherical indexing, we'll see that we can lower that floor and get better orientation precision. So traditionally, how do we index, or how do we determine the crystallographic orientation? So this is a little schematic. So we take our diffraction pattern here, and we use what we call a Hough transform. And it converts this real XY space into this, what we call Hough space, and it's a rho theta space. And essentially what happens is the bands are converted into peaks in Hough space. So we're changing the problem from band detection to a peak detection problem for image processing. And so once we find these points of high intensity, this tells us where the lines are located or the bands are located. Again, these are projections of crystallographic planes in the material. So we know the position of the detector in space, we know the position of these lines, we can figure out the geometry and measure the angles between these. And the angles between these lines correspond to the interplanar angles in a crystal. So in the software, we create a lookup table of interplanar angles for the crystals that we're interested in. We load what we call material files, and we know which bands we expect to diffract, and we can create this lookup table, we compare it, and we determine the crystal orientation. And so this is a technique that's been around now for 32 years, I guess, if it's 2024. And it's been, you know, kind of the accepted standard for EBSD for a long time. This is the first OIM. This is what Stuart Wright did when he implemented the automatic band detection years ago. This is from an aluminum sample, and it's worked really well. It's been very robust. We've been able to do some good things with it. And it, you know, I'd say it does remarkable things. This is an example from our Hikari detector from about 10 years ago. We could go 1,400 points per second looking at 30 by 30 pixels and get a 99% indexing success rate on a standard FCC nickel type material. So it was very good at finding bands even when there was kind of sparse information. You look at this, it's kind of hard to see, probably even on the bigger screen, that there's lines in there. And I noticed when I was just putting this together, if I looked at it on my small monitor, you know, you shrink it down. It's like, oh, I see the patterns a little bit better. There are band positions in there. So one thing that's important to note, you know, with all indexing, you know, the computer's doing the work. You're going to rely on the computer to find and match and determine the information that's in the pattern, and the computer can often do much better than your eye as the signal to noise goes lower. But the hough has worked well, and it has some advantages. One, it's very fast. So our current state-of-the-art camera runs about 7,000 points per second. It works in many situations. It can index lots of different crystal structures. It can look at deformed materials, but it's not perfect, and it has some cons or some challenges. The first is determining that set of reflectors, that interactive or interplanar angle lookup table. You have to tell the system which planes do I think it's going to diffract. So if we're looking at something FCC, BCC, we kind of know, but if you're looking at lower symmetry materials, there's some work that goes into determining those reflectors. Because if you don't get them right, you'll have some issues. If you have too many, it slows it down. So optimization can be a challenge. With the hough, there's lots of parameters that you can optimize, and you can do things like, okay, if the bands are wider or narrower, how many bands do I need to look at? Where on the phosphor screen do we want to emphasize things? There's convolution mask size. So there's a whole page of parameters. And for us, that's been good because we really optimized our hough to handle lots of different situations. But as users, it's a lot more to learn. How do you get the most out of your system? There's a more of a learning curve to learning the hough. As the patterns become very poor, it struggles, and poor can be defined in terms of like noise level. Some of that can be due to how you're setting up the camera. Some of that noise can just come to like your sample prep of your surface. If your sample's not perfectly polished, you don't get as much perfect diffraction, sharp diffraction, so your bands are more diffuse. And as you lower your signal, that diffusivity of the pattern blends in more with the background noise of the system. I mentioned earlier the angular resolution is somewhere between 1/10 and 1/2 degree. Again, this will depend on pattern quality. The stronger the bands, the more precisely we can find the location, the better the precision. And then there'll be issues resolving what we call pseudo-symmetry. And what I mean by that is you can imagine a cube. You stretch that 1%. If you look at it, it's going to look still like a cube. But you're going to have one orientation from this orientation and one here that look very similar to your eye and to the computer. And the way the hough index handles that says there are two solutions that are very close, and so we will classify that as a low confidence solution. So that's an area that hough will sometimes struggle. So the question is, how can we improve on dictionary indexing? And this is a question that Mark DeGraff at Carnegie Mellon University started working on about 10 years ago. And the first level approach was with an indexing approach termed dictionary indexing. And what that is we capture our experimental pattern. And I'll mention, and I'll try to mention it a few times, when we do this, we save the pattern. So right now we have a number of different applications in the software where we can benefit from saving the pattern. So it's becoming more and more common. The patterns can get large as you collect a large number of points, but storage is a lot cheaper than it also used to be. It's pretty easy to get a little portable drive and save these data sets. So we capture an experimental pattern, and then we create what we call a dictionary of all, quote unquote, all patterns for all orientations. And I'll talk more about this as we go ahead. And we compare the experimental pattern to all the patterns in the dictionary, and we find what we call the best match. And we're defining the best match as the largest dot product of a normalized column vector in the comparison. And that will be the orientation we'll assign for that given pattern. So this is just an example here from a paper we did about 10 years ago of looking at how the indexing works as a function of camera gain or noise in the camera system. So here you can visually see the pattern. This is hough indexing. You'll see here we also are doing something we call NPar, which stands for neighbor pattern averaging and reindexing. I'll have a slide or two where I explain this here in just a second, but it's another method that we've developed to improve indexing performance as pattern quality becomes weaker. And then we have the dictionary indexing. So you'll see these two are pretty similar, and you can see as the pattern quality decreases, the NPar starts to degrade. And basically we found that the dictionary indexing was more robust than the hough with NPar. At some point it starts to break down when it's very, very noisy, and we can quantify this noise level, but I haven't put it on here for simplicity. But it identifies the correct, ground truth orientation at a higher noise threshold than the hough does. So when I say NPar, what we're doing is, again, we've recorded all the EBSD patterns, and what we do is we take the pattern here in the center, which is our point of interest, and we average it with its neighbors. And we typically collect our data on a hexagonal grid. It gives us more points per given area. So our nearest neighbors typically are going to be 6. So we average these 7 patterns together to get an improved signal to noise ratio here, and then we can index that pattern. So it improves our indexing approach. I'll mention that there's another approach where, rather than just using local kernels, we use a non-local averaging approach called NLPar, which comes out of Dave Verhornhorst and his colleagues at Naval Research Lab, that allows us to average more than just the adjacent pixels, but it looks for similarity. And the reason we do that, this just shows NPar results. We've kind of seen these. Again, as noise increases, NPar usually will extract it. The trick with NPar is we are averaging spatially, so we can lose spatial information. And this is just an example looking at some fine twins in a nickel alloy. With NPar, the detail of these twins are lost. With NLPar, we're able to keep that information but still get improved indexing as noise increases. The other thing I'd say with this is, of course, if you are trying to use NPar, choosing a finer step size allows that neighbor averaging to work better. If your step size is smaller than sort of the feature size in your material, NPar will work better. So how do we build a dictionary? This is just to give an idea of what goes into creating these patterns and what we call our master patterns of the simulation of diffraction space. So first of all, we need to know what we're trying to simulate. So just like I said earlier, we have to load a material file. EBSD is a technique that generally, to analyze it, you need to know what you're looking for, or at least have a limited subset. It's not like EDS where you're going to point the beam and it tells you what's in there. You want to go in with some idea of what you're going to be looking for. And when we talk about the crystals, we want to know the crystal symmetry. We want to know the atom positions within the unit cell. We want to know the lattice parameters. That kind of defines the information we need. Then we want to know the analytical conditions. What's the acceleration voltage, the beam energy we're using? and what's our geometry of the system. You know, where's our detector? How close is it? We need that so we can match the pattern simulation to our experimental space. We take that information, we put it into the diffraction model, and then we're able to convert it to our sample orientation space. We can get a representative pattern that will match our detector, and then we can simulate patterns for different crystal orientations. So this is just an example of why this route was gone. This is an experimental pattern here. This is what's called a kinematic simulation. We can talk about kinematic or dynamical diffraction. EBSD is a dynamical diffraction-based event. So kinematic simulations don't really capture the true behavior of the electrons in the material. And so the kinematic simulations really aren't good enough for dictionary indexing. So we need a more accurate fidelity model to simulate these patterns the way we want to. So this is, again, a model that Mark DeGraff and his group developed. And it's really based on two different components. So we have a standard backscattered electron Monte Carlo model where we're just simulating the electrons. So if we look up here, we have our incident beam of a given energy. We define the beam and the beam angle. The beam angle is important for EBSD. And then we simulate it going into a material. It scatters around, it will lose energy. And then what we're interested in are the ones that are backscattering, that are coming back out. We count these and we keep at each point what's the exit energy, what's the depth, and what's the direction. And we can get this for different energies and understand the yield integrated over depth. But it gives us an idea of the scattering within the material and what's coming out. Then we can combine this with the diffraction simulation, where there's a block wave approach used to solve Schrodinger's equation. And so basically we can go through every direction on the sphere, calculate the diffracted intensity, and create what's called this master pattern. So this is a sphere. We can see what the intensity is, and we can do this for different energies as well. So we basically will define what's our incident energy and kind of step down from there and do different energy bins. And we're able to then take this, put this all together, say here's our crystal, here's our geometry, here's our master pattern, here's a simulated pattern for a given energy. Then we take our different energy bins and we do a weighted average to simulate what we think the pattern is going to look like. And so this has worked really well. Again, we do want to know as best as possible what's our detector size and geometry, and we want to know the pattern center to be able to simulate this pattern. Do we want our simulation to match our experimental as best as possible? So this geometry is basically tracked across the system from acquisition. It's saved in the data and be able to use for the spherical indexing automatically. But that's something that can be a little bit, it can have a strong effect. That's why we keep it all in there. So this is just an example. This is from the left-hand side. This is from silicon, an experimental pattern. This is collected with our Clarity direct detector, and that's why you see this crosshair here. There's 4 different segments to this detector, and it compares to the dynamical simulation here on the right. And you can see there's pretty good matching between the two in terms of like intensities here found in zone axes, the higher order lines seen in different band families. Some of the, you kind of see up here, there's some Holtz ring type effects in the pattern. So there's good matching between the simulation and what we see experimentally from a pattern. So that's good. This has been a big step forward to being able to enable this type of technology. And then we have our dictionary construction. So what that means is we now have this master pattern. We now have to say, well, let's create one for all orientations. And this is where there's a little bit of a subtlety of how to do this, is we need to cover all of orientation space uniformly. And so this sampling is done with a cubochloric sampling. And everyone loves saying cubochloric, my favorite part of the presentation. And it allows a uniform coverage of orientation space, or at least as best as possible. When we do this, we have to specify a target disorientation between the sampling points. And so this is one way of showing it here. This is looking at orientation space in a representation called Rodriguez space. And each dot here represents where we would create a simulation with 5-degree spacings between misorientations, or between different orientations. Okay, so we see that's 5 degrees, and the next one will kind of put it into context. This is at 2.5. So you can see there's quite a few more measurement points as we reduce the threshold value that we need to create the calculation. So when we do this, there's a couple of things we need to think about. First, that spacing is not just about angular precision, but it's also going to affect our indexing reliability. If our patterns are too far spaced out in orientation, it's easier to have a gap between things where matches won't work as well. So this is just an example where we use a 5-degree dictionary. You can see the matching misses more places than it does with a 2.5-degree dictionary relative to a Hough sort of ground truth data set. And you'll see this data set a lot. It's one we use to benchmark a lot of performances. So that's one thing when thinking about this dictionary, is choosing that precision. The other thing is thinking about what the size of the dictionary is going to be. So it's going to be affected both by the angular resolution that's selected, but also by the crystallographic symmetry of the material. So as our symmetry decreases, the size of our dictionary increases. So cubic is, easier, but as you go to lower and lower symmetries, you increase the number of patterns you need to use. So your dictionaries get larger. This is also important if you're starting to look at multi-phase samples, because then you have to look at multiple dictionaries. So the size of the dictionary can start to be, just large. And so that's a higher computational requirement that you need to be aware of. So kind of summarizing where we are at dictionary indexing, it's more robust than Hough indexing. That's good. It is slower than Hough indexing. And again, this is large dictionaries, particularly for lower symmetries. The angular resolution, something we need to think about. And there's a learning curve involved, thinking about these spacings, getting the patterns set up. So one of the things that we started doing a few years ago was we released dictionary indexing within OIM Analysis. So all the functionality for dictionary indexing and spherical indexing are just part of, it's a module we call OIM Matrix within OIM Analysis. So we've tried to make it very turnkey, very accessible in the software. And we started with dictionary indexing, and it works well, but it is slower, and that means that you don't use it as often as you might for other things. And that was our big thing, is looking to say, how can we improve things? So this is basically a 2D schematic of the dictionary process, just so we'll be able to understand what we do with spherical a little bit easier. So we take some reference of a known material. So this is the full scene here, and then we have different sections, different pictures of subsets of this, and then we're looking for the pattern that matches our experimental image the best to find the area within the scene. So this would be our entire master pattern. This is our dictionary. This is our experimental pattern. We do our cross correlation. We find this is the part that matches the best. And things like our sampling would determine on where do we draw the different squares to match against. So this is just a 2D representation of what we've defined as dictionary indexing. What I want to start talking about now is spherical indexing. And so this is the same image, and what we're trying to do is we take our same master pattern, the large area, here's our detected image, but now we're going to compare it in frequency space, basically passing this image along the master pattern and finding the highest peak of correlation, which tells us where it belongs in that image. Okay, so that's a 2D representation. With spherical indexing, though, it's a little more than a 2D image. It is a three-dimensional problem. So we have our master pattern here, and we then take our experimental pattern from the detector, and we do a cross correlation, but we're doing the cross correlation on a sphere. And so it's not a 2D. There's some rotational components that are involved as well, but conceptually you get the idea. We're basically moving this pattern along the sphere and finding the point of best correlation. Okay, so this is just a little bit of a schematic. So master pattern. We do this. We project our pattern onto the sphere. The best fit is done through spherical harmonic functions. So again, patterns are on a sphere, spherical harmonic functions, spherical indexing, if you're wondering where the name comes from. The best cross-correlation match corresponds to the orientation that's assigned to that pattern. This approach is extremely sensitive to small differences in patterns. So when we talk about pseudo-symmetry, I'll show an example, but it can help resolve some of these issues that the hough has. And it can be more sensitive to very poor EBSD patterns. And we're not basing the need on detection of individual bands. It's using the whole pattern information. So there's not the setup required in terms of optimizing band detection, and fragmented information is enough. I'm going to show an example of data from a rough surface. Rough surfaces means your pattern may not be consistent across your detector image. If you have a shadow or something going through the image, that will often make the hough struggle. That's not as big of an issue with this type of an approach. Okay, so this is showing the comparison again, one of our noisy patterns. This is the hough indexing with NPar, so that's sort of the best we can get traditionally. We see we get good results with the dictionary, but we get good results, pretty much identical results with spherical indexing, but we can get it significantly faster. And this is work shown by Will Lenthy, who's implemented this into OIM Analysis and was part of Mark's group at CMU. And we can see speeds up to, we can go greater than 5,000 points per second when we're doing this. I'll talk in a second here on what will influence that. But this is an example from a shot-peened aluminum sample. So aluminum can be difficult because it's a lighter atomic element. It doesn't scatter the electrons as strongly as something that's heavier atomic number. And then shot peening will add a significant deformation layer to the surface of the material. So we look at this with hough indexing at the surface. We see a lot of black areas. This is where the indexing has failed, low confidence type data. When we process this with dictionary indexing, we could come and resolve, sorry, this is on this side. This is a blow up on the bottom of this area. We can resolve this deformed microstructure. We can resolve these smaller grains on the peen surface. And with spherical indexing, we can reconstruct the same data and data quality, but again, much faster. So this was very encouraging, and so for me as a user, one of the nice things is there's only really one parameter selection you have to make with spherical indexing in OIM Analysis as it's implemented. And this parameter is one that's termed bandwidth. And basically the bandwidth captures finer pattern details. So this is just an example. Here's our initial pattern. We transform it into frequency space. We use this bandwidth to apply a low pass filter. Then we transform it back. So you can see at a bandwidth of 63, sort of the pattern detail quality that's available. And we step up to these different values to get an idea of what's the pattern look like with that different bandwidth. And the indexing time scales with this bandwidth value. And so you can see here at different bandwidth settings, the different speeds we get. The grid spacing, this is a little bit tricky because I'm going to talk about how we do refinement here. but 63 is a pretty reasonable number we use to start with a lot of things. You can imagine with lower quality patterns, sometimes having a higher bandwidth can actually be detrimental because there's so much information we're matching against sparse information. And so 63 is sort of our normal. These speeds we're talking about here, this has been benchmarked on Will's laptop. So it's a 60 by 60 pattern from our nickel pattern, and getting these 5,000 points per second. And so I don't remember if it's the next slide or not. I'm going to talk at one point about different GPUs. So it's a good time to mention that this spherical indexing takes advantage of GPU processors for parallel processing. And so I'll kind of give some feel for what the different GPU performance metrics might translate to in terms of performance for spherical indexing. So this just shows the, again, this is our bad Hough transform, good dictionary indexing, looking at different bandwidth settings here that we can see as we increase bandwidth, we start to see improvements, but it sort of plateaus off as we resolve the detail. And so practically in the software, we'll see later, when we define spherical indexing, this is the one parameter we select. There's a pull down of different levels. So it's, I think as far as learning how to use it, it's a lot easier to set and try these values relative to optimizing Hough parameters. And the other thing that I like to emphasize, and I thought about it, we take our EBSD pattern here. Here are the bands that are detected with the Hough transform. We're converting these to peaks, but it kind of gives an idea of what's the area of that pattern we're using for the Hough transform. So this is just a little model I made and could make these little rectangles to fit the bands and calculate the area relative to the area of the pattern. And see, there's about 2.5 more times area available within that pattern than what we're actually using with the Hough transform. So there's a higher, I like to think of it as an information density in the whole pattern than what we're extracting from the Hough transform. So what that means for us is we can essentially go to even lower beam doses than we could with the Hough transform. So this is again an example with our Clarity Direct detector. We use this because we can count the number of electrons per pixel. So this is a map collected at 6 picoamps, and within each pixel we have 6 electrons per pixel on average. Now our signal on the EBSD pattern is non-uniform. As you get closer to the center, there's more. As you get to the edges, there's fewer electrons, but this is just 6 on average. And looking at this is a point we're able to index with the Hough with what we call high confidence. You look at that and you can probably see at least this zone axis here. And if I pick one from one of the black areas, so this shading here, blacker areas with low confidence, so I pick one here. To my eye, I can see, I think I see a band there, but you're squinting a lot. We'd want to turn the lights off, and it may have done better last night after dinner to find the patterns that are visible there. But even with this sort of data quality with the Hough, we can get 80% indexing at these beam doses. And this is one area with the clarity that's interesting, because we can go to these low beam doses. There's no essentially noise from the detector system. There's no read noise. It's counting these electrons. So we can go to smaller beam doses and still find usable signal in here. But with spherical indexing, you see from the whole data, we're able to get basically 99% indexing with 6 electrons on average. So we're able to match to this full pattern better than we can with just band detection. So for low beam dose, beam sensitive type materials, the clarity and the OIM matrix spherical indexing is pretty interesting. So I mentioned, again, spherical indexing uses a GPU. It is basically, we use an NVIDIA CUDA compatible board. People ask, what card do you need? We have some ideas what we use. I mean, if you are using spherical, 4 gigabytes of RAM is generally sufficient. If you're using dictionary indexing, you need to be able to fit the whole dictionary into RAM. Most people, I think, are going to use spherical indexing, but we put that in so you're aware. A consumer card is fine. We're not using double precision. Again, CUDA compatible. This is just a table that I put together kind of using the latest of the NVIDIA RTX 4000 series cards. And we use this GPU benchmark here, looking at the G3D rating as a numerical metric of performance. So, you know, this first card here, the A4000, this stands because it's a single slot card. So when we want to put a card in the EDAX analyzer, we're more space limited. So this is the card that we generally will put into an EDAX analyzer if you want to do this on the microscope PC. These are all, you know, 2 slots or even 3 slot cards for higher benchmark performance. As you go up here, you can see these two are pretty similar. To give some idea, I think the laptop that we'll use has a benchmark around 7,000. The one I'm using, I think, is about 10,000 in terms of this benchmark value. So the GPU cards can get higher performance, but you can use, you know, all sorts of GPUs. It's just your speed will scale, like that slide showed earlier, and the benchmark gives an idea of that performance. So the good news is, I think you can get you know, some of these cards, they're $500 or less. They're not really expensive GPU cards for sort of these 4060, 4070-ish ranges, I think. The 4090s are a little more. So, you know, we've put here, you know, so let's measure it was previously unusable or unmeasurable. And what I want to show is how we can use both spherical indexing and NPar together. So this one has some animation here. So this is our hough indexing. So again, the points that are colored, there's some sort of usable pattern here. The point here that's black, you can see there's just not as much information there. Traditionally, we'd say let's use NPar. That jumps up here. You see our indexing improves to about 50% indexing success. We apply spherical indexing, and then that goes here. It goes from 50 to about 72%. That's just doing direct spherical matching. And then we can combine spherical indexing and NPar together. So we're averaging just those 7 neighbors. And come over. And our indexing success jumps up to about 97%. So, you know, a pretty significant increase from, I think this was about 25% to near 100% by being able to combine the spherical indexing and NPar together on a material. So this is a rolled aluminum sample, pretty heavily deformed, but we're able to extract the data that we couldn't get before by using these 2 approaches together. I was going to say something about it, and I don't remember. Oh, the other thing to be aware of, and as we go to the hands-on, I'll show and talk about a little bit more. We have the option when we're doing things, if we can choose when we want to use these different levels. You could go through and say, I want to do things in this sequence. I could say, let's do the hough indexing. Wherever it's black, then let's do NPar. Whenever it's black that's left over, then do spherical. Whatever that's black left over, then do both together. You don't necessarily have to do everything over and over again. You can be a little more efficient by selectively using when you want to use technique. And it sort of depends on how you want to approach it and what your time constraints are. But that functionality is available to say, I want to target the use of this technology only the points that need it rather than to do everything. So now I want to show some different examples from different types of materials to kind of give you an idea of what we'll get with spherical indexing. So the first one I selected was a copper aluminum ultrasonic weld. And this is one that I'd had in the lab for years, and it was just always a little bit of a challenge. One, because of preparing it. You know, we have 2 materials that are together in an interface. Trying to get a flat interface it was tricky for me. You can see, if you look at the image quality map, a little bit of the topography, I want to say blurring, but it's more of a smearing effect right there at the edge. If we look at it with EDS, we see a nice sharp transition from the copper to the aluminum. And if we do our indexing, we're getting about 80% indexing here, but we have two different grain size distributions, so we have to choose the right step size to do this. And they're similar EBSD patterns because they're both face-centered cubic phases. And so by that, what I mean is I can look at my experimental patterns, and I'm getting reasonable patterns from both. And if I look at the simulations for these two orientations, so here's the copper orientation simulated here, here's the aluminum orientation. If you look at these two simulations, you can see they're a little different. There's I describe it as sort of a flatness. There's not as much contrast with the aluminum as there is with the copper. And when you have really good aluminum patterns, you'll see the same thing, but here it's harder to tell that difference. When we go through the spherical index and we put both of these phases in, this is what the hough gives us if we try to distinguish copper and aluminum together. Okay, so essentially that's just noise. It's 50-50 pick 'em. With spherical indexing, it's closer, but it's not perfect. And again, I think this is just a little bit of a pattern quality issue with this deformed material. And then with EDS, we see there's a sharp transition. So another thing that spherical indexing can be combined in is what we call chi-scan, where we use EDS to help drive differentiation. So here, if I wanted to get the correct phase map and the correct orientation map, I just use the EDS to say, well, where there's copper, let's use the copper master pattern. When there's aluminum, we'll use the aluminum master pattern. And then we get a phase map that looks like that. So, we are getting better with spherical indexing alone, but we have simultaneous EDS, EBSD data available to get really more precise phase differentiation. And that also, in the end, we're able to get better orientation measurement. So our indexing success rate here, this is 78% here. This is 96% with spherical indexing. This is spherical indexing alone. I've put here two different confidence index metrics. So the confidence index of 0.2 with the hough transform, confidence index greater than 0.15 with the spherical indexing. These are not always necessarily one-to-one in terms of where a cutoff threshold would be. Sometimes confidence index may not even be the best thresholding metrics to identify the best data with spherical indexing. And it's just because our confidence index there is more of a cross-correlation strength metric, where this is derived by looking at differences in how the bands match. So when we show hands-on, I'm going to show a couple of the different ways of how we can try to say, once we've done our spherical indexing, what do we think are the points that are the highest confidence? And you can see here, I kind of selected this is because I knew there was a region from here where there's some areas. If we looked at the image quality map, I had it here, there were areas where the patterns were just very essentially black and nothing. We know those were bad, so we kind of find a threshold that finds those correctly, that defines them as bad points. Because it will, your cross correlation can match to say, hey, here's the highest point of correlation, even if there's not a strong correlation between those points. Okay, so this is an example from an Inconel 725 weld. So I don't think I've described, an image quality map is basically a grayscale map that's derived by looking at the intensity of the diffraction peaks in hough space. So the stronger the diffraction, the brighter the peaks, and then we map that out as a grayscale value. So what you'll see in this image, you can see there's areas that are very dark, so the patterns are going to be poor. You can see scratches in the material. Image quality is very good for finding scratches, especially when you think you've polished your material really well. And you can see these little precipitates that are present in the alloy, in the weld area of the alloy. And this is just an EDS map, and it's RGB. It's a red, green, blue map where I've picked 3 different elements just to kind of show what the distribution of these precipitates in the weld are. And these were what were of interest in this microstructure, was trying to identify these. So, there are a number of phases that are expected in this alloy. So basically we had material files that we made for all these. We load them all in and we try to match it. What you'll see here is, it does a good job of finding the nickel phase, but the different precipitates, there's a lot more of this speckling, this noise. And that noise is a sign of saying there's some ambiguity here. And if we apply our confidence index filter, you can see most of the secondary phases go away. And so, you know, one of the things with the software, you know, you can work hard to try to do this with a hough transform. Basically, you can say, I'm going to do a pass for this phase. I'm going to do a pass for this phase. You can try to optimize the band detection for each phase, because that can be important if the patterns change. What works well for one phase may not work for another. So there can be a lot of iterative work when trying to really do a good job on a system like this. And even then, you know, some of these structures just look similar. And when we try to do EDS, well, let me just point out, you know, gives you some idea of the scale. So some of these precipitates start to be on the scale of the spatial resolution of EDS. And of course, we're looking at the surface. There can also be subsurface effects. So, you know, we look at trying to do EDS information. So this is a phase clustering algorithm we have in the software trying to group our EDS data. And basically, we can adjust a threshold to get, you know, more or fewer phases, and just never find a number that say I'm perfectly happy with it. There's some noise or there's some boundary effects that's like EDS gets as close, but as these features get smaller, it's never, you know, 100% satisfactory. So there's tools we have in the software to say, let's do EDS averaging, let's try to shift the EDS for changes in interaction volume. Lots of tools to improve and improve, but again, it's more work. Whereas we can just put this in with spherical indexing and run it through, and it does a really good job just with spherical indexing of resolving these different precipitate phases. So this is a really cool application we recently did. I didn't level those, but another application here, you know, you'll notice at times I'm going to talk about sample prep and no sample prep. You know, I'm always a big believer in sample preparation. No, because this was a customer sample that was sent in, and they had done EBSD before, so it's not like I want to show you what you can do without doing sample prep. You know, you can see from here, you know, you see the scratches, so you know it's not a perfectly polished sample. But they're just trying to show, you know, even with that, it's robust enough to not need more sample prep. So it's always a hard question of like, would you want to do more sample prep? You know, the better your patterns are, the better everything works. But spherical indexing is more tolerant of decreases in pattern quality than the hough transform. But, you know, I'd never say, hey, that should be an excuse to say don't try to polish your sample. You know, things, if your patterns are more blurry, your matching will have more imprecision than if they're sharper. But you can still get better results with spherical indexing than you can get with hough. So this is a cool example. This is one Renee did over in Europe, but it's a titanium nitride coating on a polycrystalline substrate, and you can kind of see it's a rough surface, and there's no preparation. And so he was just doing this kind of for fun. He had it in there. And so this is the SEM image of interest, area of interest. And then this is the EBSD image quality map. So, you know, topographical materials show this type of contrast. So basically where it's black, it's more shadowed. As we think about the projected from a tilted surface to our EBSD detector, here the beam is sort of shadow going into the detector. When we go to the other side of this ridge, it's brighter because more electrons can now escape out of a sample that's essentially not flat. It's tilted a little bit more, so more electrons escape. So when samples are not flat, our image quality will show some topographical contrast. We can also see it in what we call our Prius technology that uses our detector as an array of essentially backscattered, forward scattered detectors. And depending on where you position that detector virtually, you can get different contrast mechanisms. So this is just a sample that's thrown in. When we look at the initial data, again, the weak patterns, strong overlap at boundaries to prevent successful indexing. And what I want you to see in this image quality map is you can see areas that look like grains, and then you can see just darker areas that don't seem to have those features. We look at the orientation map. We can filter it by confidence index. We're about 23% indexing. Okay. Now we take this, we run it through spherical indexing. This just kind of shows what we're going to get. These are examples from these good grains. So we go into one of these areas of the brighter areas. These are the as detected patterns. It gives you an idea of the pattern quality. You can see the effect that NPar gives us on these type of materials. NPar is also very useful on these rough materials because it can average out some of those local effects. And these are ones we can index with the traditional hough. Now, these are points that are from the bad areas, and you can see visually not as much data. When we do our NPar, we see the beginnings of things, but still not good enough for hough indexing. But there's enough information there. We can do the pattern correlation with spherical indexing and get results. So this kind of goes back to that concept of we're using more of the pattern. We're not limited to what's found as a band or a peak in the hough transform by using the whole image where we can match against the simulation, even if parts of it are not as information rich. So this shows the results here, spherical indexing. I just want to toggle back and forth here. You can see the improvement in sort of, I call it like, it looks like grain contrast. And that's going from our image quality map to the spherical correlation map. This is just showing what's our correlation coefficient as a grayscale. So the interior of the grains start to become sharper, and as expected at grain boundaries, we have patterns that overlap. So we don't expect a strong correlation because we have two patterns. It's trying to pick the best one from that. But you can see this map looks sharper and has better contrast and leads to that, where our indexing rates jumped from the low 20s up to the high 90s on that surface, on that coating surface. And so it also shows we can go down. Some of the smallest grains are about 30 nanometers. So that's where these the interaction volume that's being generated, you will get these overlapping patterns. And we're able to see these low angle boundaries down to a ½ degrees misorientation. And so on basically this is a sample that's just thrown in, but gave good enough data to get a really good measurement from this coating. Taking a next step from a sample, this is a fracture surface. So this is an iron nickel alloy that was fractured, and so we tried EBSD on this to start, and there were no patterns whatsoever, nothing to start with. So what we did here is we put this into our PEX2. It's a broad beam ion mill. So we use argon atoms to basically sputter the surface. So we did this with a 4-degree incident angle and 4 kV. So generally we want to minimize the amount of damage that occurs with the ion etching. So we go to low glancing angles and lower energies. In this case, we did it for 30 minutes to just sort of clean off the surface. And then from there, we could go in and say, all right, what does the data look like? So again, here's our initial image quality map. You'll see this is pretty dark. And this is our initial indexing, where you'll see it's pretty sparse in terms of number of points that were indexed initially. Now, we combine that now and use spherical indexing with NPar. Again, if I toggle back and forth, that's our correlation index map. We start to see the grain structure better, and our orientation data becomes much more populated throughout the area of analysis. And we combine those together, and we can zoom in here to an area to look to say, oh yeah, we're resolving very fine aspects of that microstructure for something that we couldn't really even analyze to begin with on a fracture surface. So this is a new type of analysis that's really enabled by spherical indexing and NPar on these types of fracture surfaces that traditionally you couldn't index well, and you didn't really want to polish these traditionally to get them flat because you lose some of your fracture surface information. So, it is important to note when we do this, we are looking at a non-flat surface. So where you're positioning the beam will be a little distorted from where you expect it to be, because we're positioning it relative to a what we expect to be a flat surface, and if it's topographic, our beam is going on the mountains and valleys of that surface. So, but the orientations are still correct. We're measuring the orientations relative to the tilted sample, not necessarily the face of the crystal facet that's exposed on the surface. So the grain size and shape may be a little off, but the orientations are correct for these type of measurements. This is another example. This is looking at a beam-sensitive biomineral. So this is a Brachiopod cross-section. Here again, in our image quality map, you can see this is kind of a low contrasty area. Here you see some grains here. And we do our initial indexing, and we see kind of similar areas. We get some orientation through here, but not so much through here. And we run this with spherical indexing. Our correlation map, if I go back and forth again, you can see how much more of the structure starts to be defined here on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side gets more detail visible. And then we're getting orientations, really good orientations throughout both sections of this cross-section of a shell. So it works on all sorts of crystal symmetries and finds that information. So that was just an example I wanted to show for that. This is showing it just with the high confidence data. Low confidence data in this case is shaded white, but you can see the different grain structures on the different parts of this shell cross section. Okay, so now what I wanted to show, this is from a high entropy alloy sample. So this is from a brazing fracture. So this is a sample before fracture. This is just showing kind of what the microstructure we're looking at. So this is a nickel alloy here on the top and bottom, and it's been brazed together with this high entropy alloy. So this is at a low magnification, so you can kind of see the grain structure of the high entropy alloy. It's much smaller than the base metal. If we zoom up in on this area of interest, we get an idea of what the grain structure is for the braze. And this, again, RGB EDS map shows us where the composition changes from the nickel alloy to the high entropy alloy. So that's kind of where we're interested. And then this was fractured, and we're looking here. So the bottom part here, you can start to see where the fracture surface is present. So this is the image quality map. You can see with the image quality map, we see these changes in the image quality that are just small changes in rotation. So it's actually pretty remarkable that depending on which bands are detected and how that subtly moves in orientation, that bands are more or less caught in the area of interest, we can see some pretty strong diffraction, deformation diffraction contrast within this grain in particular. You can see that also here in the orientation map, how these will correlate together. And that's basically, again, how bright or how strong those bands are. And then here you can kind of see that where we are in these grains transitioning from the high entropy alloy to the nickel phase here. And so the question is trying to say, well, what can we learn about the deformation that's occurring during this fracture? So traditionally, one way of looking at this is what we call a CAM, or a kernel average misorientation map. And basically what this map will do is you take a point, like we do with NPar, we look at all of its neighbors, and we measure the misorientation between the point and all its neighbors, and we figure out an average misorientation, so kernel average misorientation. This is a kernel average misorientation with a one step out kernel. You can do 2, 3, 4, whatever number of steps out you want to do. Choosing that step size can be important because you are sampling within the deformation gradient. You can imagine if my step size is small relative to my deformation gradient, my kernel average misorientation measurements could all be in the noise. Whereas if you're doing larger steps, you'd see a larger misorientation. So that's one reason within the software you can adjust that value. But what we're going to be able to see with spherical indexing is we can also lower the noise floor to be able to resolve things with finer step sizes. So this is the CAM map of that, and you can see there's some noise in there. There's some data, but there's some noise. So what we do is we have what we call an orientation refinement example. So this is an example that you can think of from the dictionary indexing, where we have some initial patterns we're matching against here on an equally spaced grid. This is our best match, but this is where the real best match is. So when we look at it with the dictionary, we would choose this point because it's the closest point, but it's not right on. And again, this is partly that we can't do too small of a dictionary, or our dictionary just becomes unwieldy. And so what we have is we can do this high precision localized dictionary. And again, I'm showing you a 2D example, but it's a 3-dimensional problem that we're measuring. So once we have our initial point, we do a finer dictionary right around this area, try to find the best match. That's of course a brute force type of an approach. So this is another approach that Chris Hsu and his group from MIT came up with, using this Boba-Kua approximation, where it's a nonlinear iterative optimization. So we have our initial measurement points here. We estimate the best point, and then with this new information, we iterate until our answers converge with this approach. And we're bounded, by our initial dictionary. There's a slight variation of how we make it suitable for EBSD, but you can look at this paper for more information. But basically, it's a way that we can make this orientation refinement faster. And then when we do it with hough or spherical indexing, we no longer have adjacent measurements to work with. We're just starting with a single measurement. But again, we estimate the best point and then iterate until we reach the convergence. So what's nice about this is this orientation refinement can use this this matching technology. We can use it on hough indexing, dictionary indexing, or spherical indexing results, and pass it through this orientation refinement. So as I show these refinement results, these are possible even with just your standard hough results. Again, you do need to save the patterns though for this to work. So this is just an example. This is looking at the hough. This is looking at the dictionary with 3 degrees, 1 degree spacings, and this is looking at spherical indexing with a bandwidth of 63 and a bandwidth, a maximum of 255. And you can see the variation we get in the CAM maps on that microstructure. But when we pass it through the orientation refinement, essentially all 5 of these converge to the same answer. So if you're interested in sort of high precision work, this is a great route that gets us there. So coming back to this, to our high entropy alloy sample, this is the CAM with standard hough. This is the CAM after refinement. And so you can see a lot of this noise has gone away within the grain. Ignore these success rates. I think those were just copy and pastes. But this is sort of the traditional coloring scheme going from blue to red. When I've been looking at these now, I've liked kind of using that color scheme, but I put the 0 at white. And I think for me, and I'm colorblind, which is an occupational hazard with EBSD, but I think it shows some of these lower end boundaries better. And you look and say, you can almost see the slip traces, what I think are slip traces in the material. And so I can come in here and say, let's blow that up here. Look at these lines, and in OIM analysis, we can say, well, let's look at the slip plane. So in this case, it's a 1-on-1 slip plane, and show the traces of those planes, basically come and click, and you can see how those slip planes align with the misorientations we see in the material. So I think they're crystallographically relevant things that we're seeing from that deformed microstructure to give an idea of the slip that's occurring in the fracture of these alloys. Then I can look here across this grain, looking at the misorientation. What these 2 charts are showing, the red lines are the point-to-point misorientation. So as we go across this line, it's just looking at what's the misorientation point-to-point as we go across this. The blue line is the point where we are along the line relative to the origin. So what we see on the point-to-point misorientation is after refinement, we've lowered the threshold, the precision value of the measurements quite a bit. We brought that down, and then so the detail within our point of origin becomes a little bit more precise. This is closer to 0 than these spikes are, so we're able to see the real changes that are occurring along where we draw the lines across those slip bands. So I've kind of referred to this as a disorientation signal to noise level, and we're able to see this level drop pretty significantly. So this is looking at a piece of single crystal silicon. So this is looking at it with the Hough indexing, this is looking at it with spherical indexing, and this is looking at it with spherical indexing and refinement. You can see the color range here has changed. So traditionally with cam maps, we go from 0 to 5 degrees. That's always adjustable, but that's sort of the default value. Here, the color scale is going from 0 to 0.35 degrees, so much smaller misorientations. And you can kind of see the distribution that we get down here. So the Hough, again, I'd say our average for something like this would be somewhere around 0.1 degree, maybe a little bit less. But you can see with spherical indexing, we get a tighter and smaller distribution, and with refinement, this comes down quite a bit. So for analyzing deformed materials, this orientation refinement is a pretty useful tool, and allows us to see our deformed microstructures more clearly. And so this is kind of an example here. This is looking at basically a couple of grains in a additively manufactured stainless steel sample. They're interested in how the subgrains form in these as a function of the additive manufacturing process. And you can see in this here, we see these dislocations, subgrain walls here, but again, there's noise in the measurements. And so traditionally, we can analyze this with what's called HR-EBSD, or high angular resolution EBSD. Again, this is comparing an EBSD pattern to a reference pattern, but it's an experimentally captured or reference pattern to be able to improve our misorientation measurements. Well, now with OIM matrix and refinement, we can get a very similar result. You can see the two here. So again, we find similar subgrain detection with the two. We see reduced noise through here, and really, I think in this case, we get a better grain definition. This one has a little bit more of a fuzzy definition of where this grain boundary is, and we can do it much faster with orientation refinement than the HR-EBSD cross correlation. And I like to emphasize this. We can do this. These are results. We can do this with 100 by 100 pixel type images to get refinement results like this. So we can get this type of precision with all of our detectors and just better resolution of grain and subgrain boundaries. Finally, the last example that I want to show, this is a Hough indexing from a lithium cathode material. So it's called an NMC cathode material. And you can see, we see grain structure, but within some of these grains, you'll see they're sort of speckled. And this is data that came from Imperial College over in the UK. They are interested in understanding, how the orientation and grain size affect battery performance. So we look at this grain. Here's the experimental pattern. So again, this is a pattern from our clarity detector. The pattern quality is good, right? So we can pretty quickly eliminate sample preparation as an effect on this. If we look at the I'm going to say yellow, I hope it's yellow, again, colorblind. We look at that orientation. This is the simulated pattern from that orientation. We look at that and say, yeah, those match pretty well. That's the unit cell orientation. But then if we look at the other color within that grain, you kind of toggle back and forth. You see the new grain present, but you can see that some of the bands are very similar. So if I put along here, these band positions are going to be found for both of these orientations. So it's easier for the band detection to start to say, hey, if we're looking at bands that are similar between this orientation and this orientation, that's where some of this speckling comes from. Okay, but if we use our pattern matching and spherical indexing, then we're analyzing the whole structure, and we're able to resolve the symmetry correctly. So that's another example of pseudo-symmetry. So just to kind of summarize on things, so spherical indexing provides indexing improvements on I call them challenging samples. Bill asked me earlier, what about an easy sample? Like that high entropy alloy. It can provide improvements there too on orientation precision. We have 30 years of the Hough working well on plenty of materials, but if you're interested in precision, spherical indexing can still lower your noise threshold on something like that. And so that's what I'm showing here for the second bullet: orientation, refinement, angular precision improvements. It can be done on Hough, dictionary, or spherical indexing results. We can get improved geometrically necessary dislocation and cam measurements. Spherical indexing is compatible with NPar. I've tried to show some examples of where they can be used in combination with each other for looking at samples that aren't necessarily perfectly prepared or rough. Master patterns can be generated within OIM matrix for spherical and dictionary indexing. As we go to the online session, I'll show you some pattern generation stuff. And spherical indexing can resolve challenging pseudo-symmetry issues with EBSD. Again, for doing this, you must save EBSD patterns for reindexing, and we do need a GPU for spherical indexing. So with that, I'll say thank you. And as far as, again, I have this, I have one thing I wanted to say here. To be aware, we do offer 2 self-paced training courses online, one for EDS, one for EBSD. EBSD covers both pattern collection as well as OIM analysis. EDS covers both as well. Those are available online. There's a lot of information here. You may be saying, oh, I didn't know about how to do that. A lot of that's covered in these courses. And if you need to submit questions, they're available in the questions pane. So with that, I'll stop and questions.
You mentioned NPar a lot with this. So NLPar also works.
NLPar also works, yeah. Yeah, so within both, you can select, basically, it's labeled within the software. I guess I should repeat the question just in case I didn't hear you. So the question from Dan was, I mentioned NPar and also mentioned a little bit NLPar, which is the non-local averaging approach. Both of those, Dan asked if they were both available, and yes, they're both available within OIM Analysis. You select it as an image processing routine, and basically when you select it, you can select NPar or then what level of NLPar you want to select. And the more levels you do, basically it's a higher computational time, but more averaging between them.
You were using the NLPar then?
On these, we're just NPar. Just NPar, yeah. Yeah.
Do you think you would be using the NLPar a little bit more? I think there's time so much.
Yeah, I think we're like some of the data that we had sent in, we tried NLPar too. Basically, I think the more usually for these type of problems, I look and say, what does it look like after each step? And then add the next step on to see, okay, am I happy or not? Is it telling me what I need to know, or do I need more tools? And from that, I think, yeah, you do, you could certainly turn on NLPar plus spherical indexing and say, hey, I'm just going to go walk away and come back and not use each intermediate step as an option.
You might repeat the question back.
Yes, yeah, thanks. Yeah.
The other question, if any estimates you have on polygon conditions, time that
Okay, so Bill asked, what effect has spherical indexing had on microscope parameters in setting up the camera and the microscope? I guess for that, the first thing is I'm always saving patterns. We'll probably pretty soon have a setting in the software saying, do you want to save patterns by default? And again, the reason we haven't before is they do get large. When you save the pattern files, you can save them as an 8-bit file to save a little bit of space, or a 12-bit file, or a 16-bit file, sorry. I usually save the 16-bit, just, again, overkill, but mostly what I find is, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the Hough indexing. I like to make sure to say, okay, my pattern center is good. but that's generally a function of working distance anyway. I can put in a complete sample and say I can just save the patterns. I don't really even need to do any indexing, but I like having an initial baseline of, like, if the weld sample, I put in just the nickel when I was collecting the data. I didn't even add the other 5 or 6 phases. I'm like, I'm just going to collect nickel, then I'm going to process it all offline, because with multi-phase samples, that's, you know, if you have 7 phases, basically your indexing has to repeat 7 times, and so it's slower online. And so I generally won't do that online. You know, in my mind, I know if I was interested in like the fastest throughput possible, then I can, you know, I can adjust things to go faster, knowing spherical indexing will be able to handle that. I generally don't do that unless I need to, but that's part because cameras have gotten so fast, right? 7,000 frames a second compared to 3,000 frames a second, you know, it's a big number difference, but sometimes that's the difference is, hey, my scan's going to take 4 minutes versus 8 minutes. And it's like, okay, 8 minutes, I can walk out, get a drink of water, come back. That doesn't affect me as much. The biggest practical thing for me probably more is the sample prep from when customers submit data of saying, okay, I'm just going to run it, where at other times it'd be like, okay, I'd probably try to figure out a sample preparation method to improve things. You know, I like to get to an indexing accuracy of 80 to 90% as a general threshold for difficult materials. You know, depending on the problem you're looking at, you have to decide what threshold is available. When I have data that's 25%, I don't feel like, okay, I'm really getting an accurate representation of my microstructure. And that drives a lot of my decisions, I think. So the question is does the current implementation work for TKD data sets? The answer is yes. And I think we're a little surprised by it because it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it's worked well. I don't have a slide in the presentation, but basically it's just taking that same projection into the experimental space, the sample coordinate space for your TKD geometry. You know, going back to the dynamical diffraction slides, you know, the simulation should be different. That's why we were surprised, is because it's going through. So it's not backscattered. You know, it's a transmitted geometry, but the patterns are similar enough when projected onto the acquisition geometry that it does match. Yeah, so we've seen, you know, can improve indexing on really fine-grained materials. We've looked at like cross sections of nano indentation where we can measure similar to the shot peen aluminum, where you get the high deformation zones, can resolve that grain structure better. All right, I'll look. I've got to figure out how to do the chat. Okay, so there's a few online too. So what acceleration voltage was used for these scans? In most, probably for everything that I've shown here that was mine would be 20 kV, which is pretty common. I don't think there was anything shown here that was lower, but with our Clarity Direct detector, we can go down to as low as 3 kV. So it's pretty common when we're running at lower KVs to use spherical indexing. Again, our material files, you know, we have these energy bins, so we can run them at lower voltages, and it's easier for that lower voltage acquisition. As your voltage goes down, your bandwidths become wider. So you're sometimes finding the hough rather than finding a single line. It might find the edge of 2 wider lines as 2 individual lines. So again, in the hough, there's things you can do to adjust the peak spacing of lines to try to do that. There's mask sizes you can do to adjust that for the hough, but the spherical indexing just sort of uses the whole pattern. There's a question here: is the orientation refinement available in OIM or only for OIM matrix? It is just part of OIM matrix. It's part of that an optional module that includes the spherical indexing. The file format does the Kikuchi patterns and orientation maps. So this works with our individual OSC files, or also our EDAX H5 files, and we save the patterns we use with the UP1 or UP2 file format that comes out of Apex or comes out of Team. If you have the old pattern files as individual patterns, you can load those into OIM Analysis and then export it out as a pattern file to make it work. Do you allow free use of students to analyze EBSD results with OIM software? At the moment, we don't have a student version or a free trial version. That is something we think about, but we have not implemented that. And then there's a question, is it possible to do spherical indexing for old OIM files? It depends on which file. So when you save a project in OIM Analysis, generally I don't use those to do it. I generally like to use the older OSC files with the pattern files. That's what I'd export. In all honesty, I haven't tried with an OIM file. It should have all the data, and you can link a pattern file to a specific data set, so it should probably work, but I haven't tried it. But generally, if you have the initial data from the software, you'd have it. There's a question, do you need to save the patterns to use the spherical indexing? Yes, you do need to save the patterns. There is a question, does it take too long to re-index after the scan? Like NPar, depending on the scan parameters, it could take hours to use NPar. I mean, it does too long is I guess a personal determination. There is a reprocessing time involved with doing that, and you know, certainly as I was preparing for this, when you have million point scans, it takes a lot longer than when they're 1,000-point scans. And again, depending on the data quality you need, is it worth that time to spend? Could this be used to identify an unknown phase or at least reduce number of possibilities? My best answer is you should turn into a later webinar we don't have scheduled yet, but that hopefully answers the question in an ambiguous enough way that doesn't get me in trouble. What are the major factors by which the indexing of magnesium alloys can be improved? Even after trying with various approaches, we are not able to achieve CIs more than 0.08 without NPar. Please suggest what you do or any polishing techniques or parameters. So I mean, this is a good question. The first thing, like here, kind of coming down to the last part, is it a polishing problem or is it an indexing problem? And traditionally, when I think about hough indexing, there are three legs of the stool for people who were at dinner last night to the problem. I mean, the first is pattern-centered calibration. Now, with the modern software systems, that's all set up, stored. You don't really have to worry too much about pattern-centered calibration, but that's a value that's used to measure the angles and define the geometry of the system. So that has to be right for indexing to work. The second part is having the right material file. You need to know the right crystallographic information. So if we know it's magnesium, then we know to use magnesium as HCP, hexagonal material. But if you had an unknown material and things aren't working, maybe you don't have the material you have. That's the second leg. And that leads us to the third leg, is band detection with the hough transform. And so, the best way that I'd look to assess that is to say, well, do you have a pattern, first of all, that you can visually see to see if the hough detection is working? And if the answer is no, if you can't set up the system to say, hey, I'm going to slow down my acquisition, I'm going to get the best pattern possible, do you see a pattern at that point? If the answer is no, that's when I usually look and say, I'm going to start looking at sample preparation. And the more you know about your sample, the more you fill in between these sort of siloed answers. You can have magnesium. So magnesium can be tricky because, one, it is difficult to prepare. It's more reactive. It's you want to get it prepared into the microscope quickly. It's a light element, and people deform it all sorts of ways. You can get twinning. Your patterns can get more muddled. And so that's kind of what I look at to determine, is it a sample prep issue? You know, if you're looking saying, hey, I see beautiful patterns and it's not indexing well, I don't worry about sample preparation. But if you're looking at saying, yeah, I'm having trouble seeing patterns. As far as polishing techniques, I think the most recommended technique for magnesium is ion beam based preparation. We use our PEX tool. Michael Hasselshire was our product manager for specimen prep and did a lot of work with the groups, I think, at Oxford University and Imperial College over in the UK, who looked at a lot of magnesium and zirconium alloys, these reactive alloys, and developed recipes to use broad ion beams on these sort of materials. Now, there's still some level of mechanical preparation that goes into it, but then as a final polishing, you use the ion beam. But you want to minimize the time between polishing and getting into the microscope. You don't want to set it out in air and let it react. Okay. That might be the last of the questions. Any more here in the classroom?
You guys tried to like run any indexing live. You're saying you like patterns that run. Should you get up to 5,000 anyway? So I run it like 2,000 or something. I can see if I get patterns off the fly, like just run there.
Yeah. So Dan asked, you know, have we thought about running spherical indexing live, just to reduce the burden of having to reprocess it? And I guess I give the same answer as the other. I imagine there'll be a webinar you can turn into in the not too distant future to learn more about it for that. Yeah, just to kind of reduce from point A to point B. How do we get there?
Data.
Yeah, and having to transfer.
Yeah, people say you'd want 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's on our roadmap of what to do. Yeah. I mean, for us, I mean, it's, you know, from using this, I mean, we've had dictionary indexing now for 5 years, maybe, in OIM analysis, and we used it periodically, but it was so slow. You had to have the right problem to say, hey, I'm going to do this. And but now with spherical indexing, you know, we've been running it, you know, probably a year and a half now internally as we've developed and tested it. And now we're always on our little Teams chat sending each other examples of, can you believe this? Can you believe this? Because it's really shifted what's possible on samples that we've said, hey, we've had this, you know, in a drawer for 10 years because we couldn't do it. And now it's like, oh, in 3 clicks, we're getting results we wouldn't have imagined. So we're really excited by it and excited to kind of put it out there, you know, in OIM where it's more accessible and turnkey to do. So. All right. Well, for those online, you're welcome to stay. We're going to take a little bit of a break. We'll probably come back in maybe 15 minutes, and then we're going to do some online demonstrations of just working through the software, kind of showing how it works, if you're interested in that. And if not, thank you for attending, and we'll go from there. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for coming to part 2 of this seminar and webinar. This part, we're going to do something a little differently, especially for a broadcast, is we're going to run the software live. You know, I'm product manager, but I've been in applications for a long time. And, you know, one of the things we try to teach our applications people is, you know, don't do things you don't know how they're going to go. So we're going to walk a little bit of a tightrope, but I think we're going to be okay. It's just, it's more anxiety driven doing it. So this is OIM Analysis version 9. This has just started now shipping from our factory this month, so it's released. We're really excited. Hopefully, most people are you familiar with OIM Analysis? At least enough that I won't go too deep into the basics. But if you see me doing something without explaining it, just interrupt, because I've used this software for a long time and do some things without thinking too much. But to kind of show you a little bit what we're running here. So this is 9. This window here, when I go to the About OIM Analysis, kind of shows what packages are involved. And we're going to be running this OIM matrix package. So this is an optional module that goes into OIM Analysis I'll be able to show you how it runs. But this is how you're able to tell if it's enabled on your system as you look at your version and see if OIM Matrix is installed. So I'm going to open a data set here. So OIM's a project tree-based data set. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to start with some from our sample data set. So this is OIM Analysis 9 samples nickel sequence, and this is low-gain nickel. And you're going to recognize this from the presentation. So when I open the data set, it gives us a lot of information here about calibration, working distance, scan dimension, step size, phases. But what I wanted to highlight at the bottom here is it will tell us if there's an associated pattern file. So in this case, it's saying there's patterns, they're 60 by 60 pixels, they're 8 bits, it tells me the location. Whenever we want to do OIM matrix, spherical indexing, NPar, we need to have these patterns available. So when you open it, you look to see it here. If you look and it's not, you can't associate a pattern file. And what it's looking for, you'll see my pattern, my scan file named is low gain nickel. That's also the name of the pattern file. So it's looking for things that have the same name. If it's off by a character or something, you can always right click. And for OIM analysis, you can answer pretty much everything. You can always right click. But you can right click on here, go to reindex configuration and say associate pattern file. And then you can load that particular pattern file for whatever data set you're looking at. So I'm going to close the summary. I'm just going to open up the image quality map just so I can show you a little bit. When we have saved patterns, some things that I sometimes use is what we call this FlexiView tab. I can look here and say I want to add a live pattern flyby. So now as I move my cursor around the window, I see the pattern. And you can see that that had a live view. I can also do what is called a static. And if I come now and shift click, it will put the patterns here. If I want more than one, I can add more statics like that so I can see my 3 points. So FlexiView stands for flexible configuration view. You can kind of decide whatever you want to load and see for that interactive viewing. But this is how I sometimes take a quick look at patterns before I'm going to do my reindexing. Okay, so the reindexer, well, before I get to reindexer, I wanted to talk for a minute about the master patterns and material files. So if I come here and I'm going to say I want to load a phase, and I'm going to go, I don't want to load this one. Let's look at I'll load austenite. So this isn't nickel, but I just want to load this to show. So we're looking at our structure information. I mentioned during the talk, we need to know what the crystal structure information group information is. So this is the space group here. These are the lattice parameters. These are where the elements are in this unit cell. Up here we see these are where these are the planes that we expect to diffract when we're doing hough indexing here. So there's these first 4 plane families. For our software, it's important to know we deal with plane families. So we talk about a 111 type, but we label it here as a 1 bar 1 bar 1. The system figures out all the crystallography. So when we define the structures, I can hit edit here. You can come in and select your appropriate space group. You can come in if I wanted to add or change what this element is. I can come here and say I want that to be nickel instead. I still want it to be the 000 position. You'll see when we put in the 000 position, because we know the space group information, it puts in the equivalent positions in the unit cell. You don't have to go in and say, I have a position at 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, 0. The crystallography engine takes into account all that stuff. So once we have that structure information, we can build the master pattern from here. So I'd come here to build the master pattern. This is where you can come in and say, what sample tilt am I using? What's my acceleration voltage? What's my maximum depth? You have a couple of different options. How many electrons do I want to use? Do I use my my GPU card? Do I want to multi-thread it? And you'd hit generate master pattern. And depending on what you're looking at, this can take a few minutes to to tens of minutes to generate patterns for different structures. Lower symmetries can even take longer than that. And so we have a library of files, and I'm just going to show you here under, we look at our files here, program files, OIM analysis materials. we have this library that we've updated of all master patterns. So all these materials have different master patterns that are available. They're energy bin, so we can select different voltages. But it's for most common materials, you probably don't have to generate a master pattern. But if you do, you enter in your crystal structure information, you come to build. Generally, when I do this, I just do 2 billion, and then you hit generate a master pattern. It's going to start up the simulation. When it's done, you just hit save as to save that as a master pattern file. So when you install OIM Analysis, those master patterns are automatically installed on your system. So with the earlier version of OIM 8, we had them as a larger file. You received a little hard drive with the material files on the hard drive, but we've been able to reduce the file size through some compression approaches to make them a little easier to distribute. So the next button I want to go into is, well, I'm going to go to this one, the pattern simulator. So I can load my dynamical simulation here. This is what allows me to come in any given orientation. So this is, from whatever point I had clicked, there should be an orientation here. When I bring up my pattern simulator, I can load from my file, bring this in. I'm going to get this pattern. I can come in and enter in different Euler angles to see what that pattern looks like. And if you have, if you wanted to compare a kinematic simulation to the dynamic simulation, you can do that through here. If you had an experimental pattern, this is using from that particular file. You can see how they differ. That one did not, because I changed the orientation. And then you have things where you can come and say, if I want to switch, say I want to switch between my kinematic or whatever there, I can flicker back and forth. This is just useful for comparing the pattern. This is just to get familiar with how, how generating the pattern works, how it looks like for a given orientation. This generally isn't used day to day with the spherical indexing, but if you're more interested in the simulation, and I showed that example of here are the 2 different patterns from that lithium battery material, showing how those 2 patterns will look for different orientations. This is where I'd come in to do something like that. So we'll go to the exciting part here. This is the Reindexer. So when I click here, it's going to open up my Reindexer window, and I'm moving this over here so I can kind of click one to the other. So what I want to show, there's a few different options from here. First, as I click around, you're going to see that my pattern changes. So there's sort of this correspondence as I click around to see the pattern. For here, we have different modes of indexing. So the first is hough. This is where we do our hough transform. I mentioned in the talk, there are a number of parameters you can optimize for your hough transform. Generally, if you ever call me to say, hey, where should I set my hough? The first thing I'm always going to tell you is say, well, hit reset to defaults. Let's start from there. We've tried to set the defaults to work for most common materials, but like I mentioned in the talk, there are lots of things you can adjust as you have variances away from that. Then we have our dictionary indexing and our spherical indexing, and we'll go into these in a little more detail, particularly for spherical indexing. But as I mentioned, there's only one parameter we have to deal with as far as how we set up for spherical indexing, and that's this bandwidth value. So we'll start with 63, which is our common starting point for everything. The geometry parameters are what are brought directly from the system itself. So when we collect the data, it records what our sample tilt is, our detector elevation and azimuthal angle, how the detector is pointing on the system, and then what voltage we were using. For some older data sets, you might have to manually input. It'll put in and say, hey, you want me to take my best guess, or do you want to manually put something in for that? And then we'll talk a little bit, next one is hough peak. So if you've never seen this, this is where it will re-index, but rather than using the save patterns, we save just the position here of where these bands were detected in hough space. So this is a quick way, if you feel like, hey, my band detection was fast, or my band detection was good, and I want to re-index fast, you can do this hough transform because it's not having to process the image processing band detection for hough peak. So this is kind of a quick way if you needed to do something that's available. These are saved directly during your data collection. And then we talked about refinement. Here's your orientation refinement. This is where if you have specific pseudo-symmetry relationships you want to resolve, or specific phase differentiation relationships, like you have an orientation relationship during a phase transformation, you can specify that, and you want to look for that difference is where that would come in. So again, I want to talk about spherical indexing. So the first thing we need to do is make sure the phase is loaded correctly. So here you'll see this is the phase that was selected during data collection. So it's a nickel phase, but there's no master pattern associated. So I could build one, but in this case, I'm just going to load one. And again, I want to go to program files, OIM Analysis, materials. So just go to my nickel. And you can see, you know, if the naming's a little different, it says I'm going to replace everything from nickel to Ni, and I can just say yes. And here's my simulated pattern. I can come and index this pattern with spherical indexing. If I come click here, it's going to show you the orientation that matches versus the pattern here. So if I turn off the solution, you can see how those compare. If I hit go, here's a new one. You can kind of see that, yeah, that matches pretty well. Again, this is the spherical confidence index. This is that correlation value. So in this case, we're getting 0.5, 0.51. So this is a tool. I kind of get an idea of what that range is going to be for different values. Just to do a quick check. And again, if you watch me over here, this button here, go, is what starts the indexing. This is what toggles the solution on and off. And this is what will undo the last indexing routine. Okay, so again, we've set up the bandwidth of 63. Image processing, there's some different tools we can use here. So I'm going to start at the top. None just shows the live pattern, or the saved pattern. You know, on our Velocity, Hikari, older DigiView cameras, we use a circular phosphor screen, so we can mask that out and say, let's just look at a circle. That's what that's there for. And again, we're just throwing out, not trying to match against something that we have no data for. The Clarity uses an array of 4 256 by 256 pixel chips. So that's where we have this crosshair. We call these seams here. We mask those out when we're doing our pattern matching. And then if you're really ambitious, we have a custom mask. So there's sometimes we were doing experiments where we were rotating how far away from the sample we had to be to detect the patterns, and we were rotating up to maybe 70 degrees away from the detector, and spherical indexing could still index these really well. But we were looking at playing, well, you can mask, as you rotate away, half your pattern's going away, so you could mask that out to get improvement. So Stephen was asking a question earlier, you know, looking at these topographical samples and things, you know, looking at saying how could you mask for those different topographical effects as a way to kind of even improve things further than what I've shown. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this at circle. Here, the next step is NLPar. So we have it actually labeled as NLPar. And here you can see this is where we can do just the nearest neighbor kernels or the different levels of NLPar. And we also have with NLPar these different decay setting times. So again, as you increase this more and more, it's expanding the number of patterns that it's trying to average. So NPar is just looking at your nearest neighbors. So when I hit, turn that on and off, you know, these are good patterns. It's hard to see the difference. But in a second, I'll show you on bad patterns, and you'll be able to see the effect. And same thing with this. If I turn on some level of NLPar and turn this on and off, you don't see a big difference because they're good. So for now, I'm going to leave that off. This is something here under background correction that it's a really good tool, especially for some multi-phase samples. So, you know, your background scattered signal depends on orientation, but it also depends on the atomic number of your sample. You know, aluminum scatters in one, you know, has a certain profile. Nickel will have a different profile based on the atomic number of your material. So if you're really trying to get the best background, sometimes what you want to do is have a partition based on phase and do a partition-based background. So what it will do is, you know, if I had, say, had an aluminum phase, turn on a partition, it'll look at only the aluminum patterns, use that to create a background, and then do the subtraction. You know, that's, again, this is, it's if you have things that have a huge amount of contrast, can be interesting. So one example from is like the diamond with the cobalt binder, where there's a very different intensity between the two. I'll sometimes set that up to help equalize the background subtraction between them. Or you can just do a data set based subtraction. And that kind of goes back to your question, Bill. Sometimes when I collect data, I don't do any background processing online because I know I'm going to do it all offline for some samples like that. These other two, I mean, quad equalization goes when we're dealing with the clarity. We have 4 different quadrants, so it normalizes between the 4 of them. And then a dynamic background is where it kind of blurs itself. So there's some image processing to blur and then subtract that same pattern. The one that we most often use for spherical indexing is this adaptive histogram equalization. So it kind of enhances the contrast within the pattern. So I generally leave this on. Like anything else, you know, it's a processing. So there is some time that it takes to do that, but you can see we put here it's recommended for spherical and dictionary indexing. We also have auto brightness contrast, and we have this advanced tool kit of different image processing recipes. So one question we had was on doing TKD with things, and TKD, depending on how you prepared it, you might have a variable sample thickness. So a single background doesn't work with that. And so we can do some dynamic things with this recipe toolbox to address things like that. Also, as we go to low beam doses with the clarity, sometimes division works better than subtraction. So we have these. You can save them as recipes for different applications. But to start, I just say we'll leave the adaptive histogram on. We have spherical indexing set. Everything else, we're not doing chi-scan, which is using the chemistry. We're not going to worry. You can see there's all sorts of things like if we want to save as a new file, retain original values, things like that. There's lots of things you can do to process that data, but we won't go into that. And so I'm going to hit reindex, and then it goes through and does the spherical reindexing. So you can see in this, it's nice and fast. I hit return to reindexer, I can close it, and I can look and say, here's my original data, and here's my spherically indexed process data. And I can get rid of those dots, and you say, yeah, the different indexing approach works well and basically replicates what our standard is with the hough. So that's an easy example because, you know, they're both good patterns. But going to the high gain example, one thing I always use is this close all to kind of say I'm going to clear the slate and start. So here the image quality for this high gain nickel, you don't see as much grain contrast. And when I look at my patterns here with the reindexer, you can see that, you know, there's some data there, but that's more of like the more sparse data I was showing earlier. You can see we've already set up the nickel here. So I'm just going to leave all the same settings and say go. So these were data that were collected with our Hikari data sets when we were developing this, and there's just basically a gain on the camera. So we had, you know, 0, no gain was our low gain setting, and then we had a setting that said this is about the maximum we'd typically use. So with our velocity and with the clarity, we still have a gain setting, but we generally don't change it because we're interested in the lowest. You know, we don't want to artificially add noise when we don't have to. The velocity, we've just taken it away because it's a lower noise sensor anyway. So we don't, yeah, from that perspective, we don't adjust it. So the question is, does it reindex with a fixed pattern center? And the answer is no. And so I'm going to hit return to indexer. one of the things here, it's a great one, the one I didn't show, is we have the PC shift that basically, you know, we know from the sample geometry how much it moves as a function of deflecting the beam. And so we adjust the pattern center dynamically as we go across the scan. And then you can go through, if you're not happy with it, you can come and say, I can come and reapply these corrections to optimize for that. And so this is the original data here with the nickel. Here's the data now with spherical indexing with the bandwidth of 63. So you can see it extracts a lot more data than you could get before. And you know, if we looked at the data here, just so you can get an idea of what the difference is with here, I can say here's the NPar. So you start to see where the NPar is, and then if I turn off my NLPar, you can see how that pattern quality just improves with that. So I can have the NLPar turned on, I hit reindexing, and you see NLPar at the highest level has a pretty significant time penalty relative to where we were going before. But if we come here and say 2, goes faster, and then NPar itself should be pretty quick. So, you know, this is a function of, it was a function of a lot of things, but the biggest thing for this, I think, is, well, I mean, one, there's the pattern size, and 2, where they're stored. So pattern size, you know, generally, the most common resolution that I use is 120 by 120 pixels. I think we see the best performance overall across the range with that. These are a little smaller for our demo data set. But the other thing is, like, what kind of hard drive is it stored on? So I will often, you know, I carry around my little solid state drive to carry data from the lab back home and things. And I'll just rerun it from there. But I can see if when it's talking to the hard drive, it's slower than if I copy things over to my faster hard drive on my computer directly. So if you're trying to maximize your throughput time, I'd recommend to say, yeah, get it stored on the hard drive with the fastest access time, and it's going to process faster. This is one, I don't remember, it's like, well, so the question is, what GPU do I have? So, and I looked it up this morning to try to remember, and I forgot still, Stephen, but I did try. It had, when we looked at so it's a Quadro RTX 3000. And it had a benchmark about 7,500 compared to, so the system that we generally aim to put on our detector has a benchmark close to about 20,000. So, you know, factor of 2-ish in terms of that 3D metric that we use to get a feel for performance. And I mean, you can see it's still pretty fast. It's just, yeah, people ask what we recommend and what we sell. We've kind of chosen a high performance one to include with the system for the single slot GPU. Any questions so far? So far, so good. Okay, so what I want to do next is start looking at some customer samples. So I'm going to open a new project. And so this should be, so this is Diamond here. So this is our Hough indexing, and you can see, you know, there's a little bit of cooking show type things. Is we have some that are already processed, but this is loading in the Hough data. And so here we're just going to load. So here's our image quality. Here's our orientation map. And so with this, so this is an example because I'd renamed this with a -HI so I could remember that it's Hough. So I'm going to come here to reindex configuration, associate pattern file, and go back to my desktop, Diamond. So this is the pattern file. So again, if I look here now and do my flyby, I can get an idea of the range of patterns. So pretty good pattern quality. you can see every once in a while you see, let's see if I can get it, something like that. That's generally going to be, I expect maybe a piece of the cobalt where it's getting a higher scattering. So this is an example where, you know, we've saved it with background subtraction on, so we've kind of lost that information. But if we save it with background off, then we can come and say, let's find these patterns in particular, do a different subtraction, and then we might see more of the signal from a cobalt. So just to explain, I didn't explain the sample. You might be able to do it better, but these are like diamond cutting tools. So they're synthetic polycrystalline diamonds, and they're built with like a cobalt matrix to hold them together. So the sample prep are sometimes challenging for this, is probably a fair way of saying it. Just obviously diamond is hard, you know, in both terms of the word. But you can see, you know, with the hough indexing, we get reasonable results from a lot of the diamond, but there's some smaller grain stuff in here we want to try to resolve. So just to show, again, we'll set this up. Spherical will come to phase. We have a diamond master pattern we had available. Generally, for something like this, I would probably maybe turn this up maybe to 95 and hit go. So, and as it goes, you'll see, you know, this is a legacy thing from when our scans used to go, you know, points per second, and you could actually see it. These are pretty nonsensical displays to have, but whenever we've taken them away, people said, where did it go? So we've left them in there. But when we reprocess, this is something hopefully you're familiar with from Apex, but we put this progress bar here, and it gives an idea of what's the indexing performance as a function of time through your scan. And the reason we have this is, you know, we at the end of the scan would display average confidence index, but we'd seen over the years that people would come in and say, hey, I started my scan fine, the middle's bad, I come back in, it's fine. And if you'd look at this, you could look and say, yeah, it started fine, our confidence index goes down, and it'd be correlated with like the air conditioner going on in the room, and your scan coils go a little out of focus. Then they come in the morning, it comes back to equilibrium and it's back where they started. So, you know, unless you're going to stay overnight, we thought, well, you want some sort of a temporal indication of confidence index while you're indexing. And so that's the legacy of this, is it gives an idea of how things go as a function of time. And this is just derived on confidence index. So if I show this online, I'll sometimes turn the beam, you know, I'll take it out of spot mode so we don't get a pattern. You'll see this will go to red if it's a low confidence index one. Okay, and you can see we can turn these displays on and off. As with anything, there is some computational time that comes to displaying this, so I don't think it'll make much difference if I turn those on and off, but they are options. And again, that's one of the things we do with our software in general is we try not to force you to a path and take away your options. We always want to, you know, this is used for science. It's used to ask questions that haven't been, or to answer questions that haven't been answered, and sometimes haven't been asked before. And people will say, can I do this? And our goal is always to answer yes. Now, the flip side is, if you're new to EBSD and you answer this, we can make it look pretty complex of, yeah, you just this, and this, and, you know, no problem. And again, we point to training courses and things to help address it. But the way I like to describe it is that OIM essentially grows as you use it. As you start to have more questions, the answers are built in there. There's tutorials and help files and things that help make that really accessible. That's the reason you'll see a lot of these options, is that, you know, yeah, I can just, like I would describe with the cobalt and the diamond, we can imagine there's times where you want two different backgrounds, and that's when that would come into play. All right, I wanted to let I picked the one that's going to be a little bit longer, but we'll let it run for another minute. Any questions while it's running? Bandwidth. So I did it because the patterns look pretty good. So if you remember what that bandwidth does, when you transfer it to frequency space, it's basically a low pass filter. So as we decrease that number, we're getting rid of more of the detail. So when I have nice looking patterns like this, I want to have a match to a little bit more detail. And so it should match a little more precisely. I don't know. Will Lengthy would know the answer to that, like that, but I'm not. I took that slide out because I was like, there's no way if anyone asks me questions about this, I will be anywhere close to answering. Yeah, I can find an answer to that better and let you know, but so I usually start with 63, and that's what Will has basically said, start at 63. And what I look for is if my indexing, if I see noisy speckles where it's like, okay, it doesn't seem to be matching in areas that have good patterns, then I'll turn that up. But it's I'll talk a little bit more. One of the and I've got to remember not to go too far from here. You know, one of the things that's tricky is deciding what data do we think is good data. And because traditionally we use confidence index, but the confidence index distribution with Spherical is now different than it is with Hough indexing. So when we look at this data here, you know, I look at this, so you'll see when it's completed, it comes under rescan, and I can come here and say, show me my map, and I can put those two next to each other. And we see, yeah, we see these smaller grains are more resolved, but we're keeping what we found in the larger grains. So there's a couple of things we can do is, one, I can come in here and say, let's try what we traditionally do and say, do a confidence index greater than 0.1. And you can see it gives me an idea of what this distribution is. So the max is 0.6, the average is 0.4. And that gives me one metric of indexing success. So it says it's 99.8% of the points, or 99.8. And if we look carefully, there might be a few black clusters. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is to say, let's group by number of points that are together with the same orientation. So I can come here and say, let's create another partition, and rather than doing confidence index, come here by grains and say, you know, our default grain would say there has to be at least 2 pixels. Now looking at this, I'd say I like to do maybe 5 pixels. And then it's saying if there are 5 pixels that have the same orientation, then we're going to consider that to be good data. And you can apply another rule where you can say, maybe I want those to have to be spread over at least 2 rows as well. I won't do that here, but I can hit that, hit OK. So you can see with this definition, it says it's 98.5% indexing. And we look at that and then we say, okay, now we can see a few more of the black points here. So these other black points, I can create another partition where I say, I want to look at the grains that are smaller. So I've switched here to partition, gone to smaller. Make sure I did that right. Grains, partition smaller than 5 pixels. And then I did something wrong. Partition size less than or equal to 5. No, I did something. Well, I won't show you that then. But you can conceivably look at the points that aren't in that partition to see which ones have been thrown out. You know, I don't usually do it by grain size. I do this sometimes with confidence index to say, show me less than 0.1. And again, there shouldn't be many points here that match it, through 15. So this is the idea is you can come in and say, let's look at the points at a low confidence and see, you know, maybe these are the ones I'd want to run NPar on, or try to understand what's different with these points. But you know, for me, when I look at these two, trying to say, you know, what's the difference? You know, you can go in and say, are there points there that, you know, is 5 the right setting here? Does it look like the microstructure that would make sense for that sort of material? This is all the material, and I think in the end we said, yeah, this is pretty representative of what's expected for it. The other things we can do is use some of our other metrics. So like, for example, this is the one out here. This is the image quality here. You know, you could also combine that into one of the partition rules. That's sometimes useful when you're like going off of a sample and the pattern quality goes down. But you know, sometimes when you do that, there's shading, so you'll get a you know, a spherical into match of something consistently, but it will it'll have a low correlation factor. And so by using confidence index, number of grains, image quality, you can kind of limit down and say, yeah, here's the areas that I feel like I should be analyzing. And so, yeah, once we have this data, then, you know, from here we can go ahead and do the rest of our analysis. So, you know, this here we can look at the grain distribution. This is our grain quick map. We can look at our grain size, and in particular, the ones that were of interest, I think, were these smaller grains in the material. So you can come and highlight those to find just those particular grains and do an analysis of smaller grain orientations. Any questions on your data for a quick pass? Or so, all right, so I'm going to show some more examples.
I was going to ask about saving without the back. So normally when I'm doing an analysis, that looks like do the hough transform and then save it as well. You would basically not be doing any of that background.
So
to be able to get this data better for reprocessing.
So the question is, you know, because of the variation in backgrounds, when you're collecting data, should you save your patterns with or without the background? And I mean, my answer is it will depend on what structure you're looking at and what you're trying to measure. Most of the time, I still save it with the background on because it's, you know, the harder cases are like diamond and cobalt, where there's a huge difference. Yeah, so stuff like that, that's when I would leave the background off. Things where it struggles a lot with hough transform indexing is a good probably rule of thumb. If you're like, I can't get the hough to reliably do stuff, then turning that off gives you the most flexibility. If the hough finds bands reliably from most of your area, you're probably all right leaving it on. The drawback to, again, the real drawback to turning it off is you have to do it in OIM analysis, so there's some time penalty to it. But that's really the only difference.
Was the refinement already done? Was that
that's a separate step. Yeah, I should have shown that on your sample. I can actually, because that's the refinement is even. So we have this. So you can see that this is Will Lengthy, who implemented and did this, is great. He's, you know, smart and helpful and wonderfully nice. He went and re-indexed at different levels of NLPar and NPar too, to kind of look at the effect, see what we could get. So, you know, if I open all these together, we have 4 of them. So here's so I'm going to close these. Here's the original data. Here's the NPar. And here's NLPar 1 and 2. You know, and you can stare at those and try to see what the difference is. And again, if we put in our partition grain size 5 or larger, so that's the 96%. And I can just copy and paste these over. So if I look at this, so this is with that. That's the, sorry, there's some review. That's about 96%. So not a huge difference with NLPar there. Some review, yeah, almost 97%. And so NPar is probably going to be somewhere a little bit less than that. That's actually, so NLPar actually did the best, 98.7%. So that kind of gives an idea where that structure is. And I'm not sure what bandwidth Will did when processing those. But as far as the refinement, if we come back here to the original data, image quality, and come here to have to associate the phase. So when I select this to do the refinement, I click this, and we're not worried about pseudo-symmetry or orientation relationship. I just hit reindex, and then it will just go through and do that refinement. And that you can, again, if you have hough data that you're happy with the indexing, you just want the refinement, you can go directly from hough to the refinement as well. Okay. So here, so this is a magnesium sample. So here's the original map. So again, I open it. It has the patterns that are saved here. I can come look at the original data. So again, when I look at just data in general, what I tend to look at with hough data is I'll come in and say, show me my confidence index greater than 0.1. And this gives me some value here. This is 0.569. Now, one of the things we have, though, we have what we call this confidence index standardization. So if we compare these two maps, you can kind of see in this central area, there are points that are shaded the same color, so the same orientation, but they're shaded black. So we have this routine that says, well, if they're the same orientation, we can probably give it a higher confidence index. So we can hit that button, and then we see that that fills in a little bit better. So our confidence index now we say is about 84% correct to start. So with this, I could come here now, load our patterns, again with phase, got magnesium loaded. So this is hexagonal. Image processing, we'll just kind of leave with just to let it start. Again, it's going to fire through this here, and we get some results. So I'm not going to run this one all the way through. We'll go to sort of the kitchen show result where we have, here's our spherical indexing results here. Here's our original data. And again, I'm just going to create a partition. I'm going to look at two different ones. So let's look at it with the confidence index 0.1. But you see our distribution is a little bit less. So that gives us 99.1% indexing here. And then we have this where it's, let's do our confidence, our grain size. And there it's about 97.8. So usually I take the lesser of the two as the safest to go with something like that for, if I compare this to this, for that sort of an improvement on indexing performance. So you can see we basically fill in a lot of these darker points here where we can resolve the structure. And then if I remember this data set right, you can see that there, it looks like the sample has a little bit of, you can see the contrast is pretty flat. If we look at the patterns themselves, they're reasonably sharp, but there's a little, you can see that intensity variation. That's, I think, there's a little bit of surface topography to that. So what we do with something like that is we can go ahead and run it with NPar, and we can copy this same partition and paste partition and look at it, and you can see NPar cleans that up a little bit more, where it jumps from there to about, again, 99.5%. So you can get some nice results from the magnesium. Any questions on this one? Oh, yeah, so here, whatever I've defined, so I can always right click. So the question is just how I'm copying and pasting the partitions. So I can always right-click on a partition and go to Properties, and it's going to show whatever the definition is for that partition. And you can see you can define these however you want. And then I can right-click and say Copy Partition Parameters. And then I can go up to another data set, and there's a Paste Partition Parameters. So it's just, I don't have to type it over and over again. And this is also useful when it comes to using these partitions. This is a pretty cool thing in OIM. We have this batch processor up here. So if you have a bunch of data sets you've collected and you wanted to do some processing, you can set up these different partitions as templates, and then it can run through that with the batch processor to basically systematically analyze your data. And that's similar to what you can do. I say that you're also able to do here. Once you've set up your parameters, you can batch re-indexing. So if you have 10 samples you wanted to do spherical indexing on, you can set it up and then say, I just want to run these as a batch, and it'll go through each one too. So it's designed to be able to handle multiple samples, and that can be just a collected 10 samples, it can be from an in situ experiment, it can be from a 3D collection. You know, one of the applications for 3D serial sectioning is, you know, like speed is really critical, so they want to be able to like laser cut a surface and not have to do a cleanup cut. Well, Spherical and NPar allow them to extract data and save them time on the acquisition side through that approach. Okay. Go to the, this is just a steel, this is a good example. So this is a data set that we had that they, this is the first data set. So this is a heavily deformed sample. When we look at the image quality, it kind of looks like that shell I showed earlier. As you can see from the image quality, where there's probably some grains, and then where there's probably not so much data. If I look at my orientation map from there, you know, we see orientations, we see a lot of noise. This is where that threshold of a confidence index, again, I usually use with hough 0.1, will show this data. I can do my standardization, but yeah, there's not a lot of data that's initially present. Okay, so my process would be the same. I won't run each of these, but I'd come in here. I can see the patterns. This just gives you an idea of the pattern quality where it's good. So you see a pattern there. You come over here, it's not so good. But running it through, this is one I ran through with, I'm going to do spherical indexing first. And I get something that looks like that. And again, this is not, you know, at this point, it's not 90-something% indexing. And I'll just use my 5-grain tolerance. This is like 30% after spherical indexing. So this is a tricky sample. So the next thing we threw at it was to say, well, let's try it with NPar and spherical indexing. And I'll just copy and paste this partition. And we start to get something like that, where we're about 72, 73% indexing success. So at that point, I was looking at it thinking, okay, what should I do? So my solution for this was to say, let's just do kind of like what we did on that fracture surface, where I just cleaned it up in an ion etcher for an hour. I just put, this is a little sample. I couldn't do anything else. I couldn't repolish it, which was my first thought, but it was a little thin piece of metal. So I said, well, I'll just throw it in the PEX, let it run for an hour and see where we go. And so I can copy and paste this. So this is what we got after an hour with the PEX. And then this is with the PEX with spherical indexing and NPar. And essentially now we're starting to get of a level here, you know, 88, 89% indexing success. Feel like, okay, that's probably starts to be where we're getting some usable data from that. So we started from here to here, you know, with sample preparation, spherical indexing, and NPar. So I thought, okay, that's a pretty good improvement. Questions on that one? Now, so this is, so here's a steel with a, no.
In that previous data set, we're got an 80%. If you create a partition that implies the areas that are still low partition.
Yes.
Only process those with higher number of home bandwidth.
Yes. Yeah. You can recombine them. So what happens is, so when we, I'll look at this. So this is a sample that, this is a steel sample. There's a few phases in here. So when we look at the phase map, you can see it's pretty noisy. So there's your steel here, a couple of nitride coatings on here. So we set this up. So this is a multi-phase one. But what would happen is, hello, data set, where did you go? All right, I don't think it's happy. I'm not sure what happened here. I'm pragmatic thinking sooner or later that's going to happen when you keep opening multiple data sets in the same session. Of course, Narayan's here watching this part, so you know, I'm going to go to the woodshed later. Okay, but this is here. Let's do that. So with this, what happens is you can see. So the question is, if we wanted to selectively index it can any partition. It can be low confidence data. It could be a particular phase. Whenever I select things, when I re-index here, you'll see on our little tooltip, it's re-indexing that partition. So if I only wanted to re-index what's been identified as iron, I could select this and then go to my re-indexer. And then when I do my re-indexing, it's only going to do the iron. So basically, you can set up a partition to say, show me the low confidence points only. And then when I do my indexing, select that partition and only index that partition. So the question is, would we want to try dictionary indexing when there's fewer points? It's a great question. I really don't have a great answer. So far, no, I haven't. There are a couple of like pseudo-symmetry problems where we've thrown dictionary at it and we say, yeah, that may be a little bit better than spherical indexing. I haven't done a lot for like deformed stuff where I've said dictionary seems to match better. They seem to have very similar enough performances. I haven't done that often, but you have the option. So this here, I'm going to go to all data to do the analysis. Again, I'm not actually going to run it, but in this case, we would go to each one. So you'd see, I'd say I want to load. I got to go to my desktop here, still with coding. So this is the iron 3. This is the iron 4, and you can see it tells me I'm changing the name. And then for the iron here, I would load I'd have to load ferrite, which should be, you can use a VCC master here. So I have those in here, and I'll just hit reindex. Not do that there. There it's going through, you can see it. Goes through each pass for each of the 3 phases. And then when we're done, I can now look and say, here's my initial phase map. Here's my final phase map. I did something wrong. Here's the final phase map after spherical indexing where I had it before. And you can kind of compare to see, here's how it's resolved that much, much better. So it's really, for me, it's pretty cool because traditionally on a lot of these things, we'd have to apply chemistry. And now we can see the pattern detail enough that we don't have to rely on that. but we can use EDS to supplement it. And that's important because, you know, again, we have interaction volume differences. You can kind of see the scale here is 4 microns. Our interaction volume is, you know, 1 micron-ish. So on these smaller scale features, we have to play a lot of tricks to try to extract the EDS in the best possible way. And being able to do this directly is just a nice tool to have. Okay. Now here, so we have, so this is another one. This is another steel with some precipitate. So this is the image quality map. You can see the precipitates that are in there. When we look at the phase map, we see a lot of noise. And again, I think I asked you during the collection if you had, maybe it was this one or the other one, if you had chemistry. But if we look at it after spherical indexing, here we see that resolves that quite nicely with the different phases present in this steel sample. And again, you can see this is on these smaller scale features that we're able to resolve that a lot clearer. Okay. Questions so far? I'm hurrying because we're about out of time. So I know we're not really on a timeline, but I don't want to keep people too long. But I also want to go through everyone's data. So this is a data set here. Now this one's interesting. This one's one I'd probably spend a little bit more time on thinking, but we've just recently received these this week. So this is titanium. There's 2 different phases. This is the initial data. This is the image quality map, and you can see this is a much larger area. So you can tell that when you look at from the scale bar, but you can see here that there's a variation in basically beam intensity across the field of view. In the center of the field of view, we're getting more electrons, and it goes out to the edge. The patterns are getting weaker, and that's just a field of view effect. And you can see kind of that in the pattern. In the center, they're brighter, and then you start to see the shadowing from one side to the other, and that's what's being detected in that image quality map. I think on this, the goal was large area collection. That's why you'll see here, this is collected with our Montage feature. So there's these row column designations where we define, hey, we want to go to the top left area, we want to go to the bottom right. What magnification do you want to use? It's going to put things together, and then it will stitch things together in the end. If you right click on these data sets, you'll see we have some stitch options where we stitch with this row column nomenclature. You can put together different amounts of overlap, and it will find the alignments and then create a final data set for that whole field of view. So yeah, we basically you can start to think about centimeter scale resolutions on large scale microstructures. And with the modern cameras that are fast, you can still do that with sufficient spatial resolution to characterize things.
How do you run the Montage imaging, like field of view? I told you it's like we get the best data at about 500 microns. But
yeah, I'd say that. I mean, I usually run at about 500x.
Or do you like run a little bigger and try and have a little more overlap to stitch later on?
No, I'll still run at about 500x and use as many tiles as it takes, and I usually just use the 10% overlap. So we have 2 different. I guess I should make sure the question was, how do we set up a Montage? What parameters? So when I look at it, I mean, I wouldn't want to run at this low of magnification to avoid this beam intensity shift. So I would try to fit something to say I want to kind of keep that so that it's a constant intensity. Now, if we look at the orientations, it doesn't really make too much difference. We're going to be able to index it. It's more just if you put together a stitched image quality map, everyone's going to ask you questions and say, why does it look like that? And you have to explain it. So that's, and the other thing, when you're looking at this, so we're looking at a tilted sample, a projection of the area. So you can start to get some trapezoidal projection with a tilted sample. So usually when I set it up, we have an option in Montage of, do I want to look at my regular rectangular aspect ratio? I usually use a square field of view, because it, you know, basically this is where it's worse, is out at the corners, because you're at your maximum in two directions. And so I'll turn that off to kind of crop that into a square. So it means I have to have more tiles, but it will stitch those together. When we collect Montage data, we have two different options. One is we can just collect it all as a data set. So we just top left, bottom right, go, and it just puts them all together. It does everything just as a go, but that's kind of the brute force method. You know, the option I typically use when I'm trying to get good data is I do multiple fields, save them each as a field, and have some overlap so it can identify things, and I can do things like save the patterns and do this other processing. And then you can, that's where that batch processing comes in handy as well. Again, for something like this, it all depends on the feature size you're looking for and what you're trying to measure. You know, I think intuitively everyone wants perfect overlap on every field, but that sometimes is harder to get, you know, without manually inspecting. You know, you can certainly go in the software and say, I'm going to look at every field and get it to line up as best as you can. And if you're looking at 4 fields, it's easy to do manually. If you're looking at 400 fields, you get bored after about 4 fields. So you having that automatic alignment is nice. Having that overlap to do the final matching is nice. I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully. So this running through. So here, this is with the spherical indexing. And again, now this is one that's a little tricky because the step size, again, this is looking at a large area. So the step size versus the feature size is a little different than some of the single fields. So if we put in a 5-degree grain, you can see that we get like 80% indexing. But if we look at a partition and say, well, let's just do, you know, we need to default, we'll do 2 degrees, then that jumps up some in terms of performance. And that kind of just goes back to your step size type of performance, but you can see it does a really nice job, you know, re-indexing versus if we looked at our initial data with a confidence index, just kind of 0.1 again. You know, here it's down at the 60, and we'll do the standardization. So here you can see where we're at, that area through here, it improves stuff. Now, this kind of through here a little bit, that's probably what I'd want to look at a little bit more detail to say, why is that, you know, not getting as much data as we were getting before? And I think that comes down to part, again, we just have a big variation in signal intensity, these left to right sides. So I think that's an average, kind of where another background might be useful, maybe to try a dynamic background. Okay. And then, so the last one is this TWIP steel. This is a twinning induced plasticity steel. So these are cool microstructures. And I have to say, I haven't had a chance to look at this one in much detail. We just, when did we send this in? Yesterday, I think it was. I don't, it's whoever, I'm not sure who sent this one in. Maybe they're not here in person. But this was the initial data here. And again, you can kind of just see from the structure that this one is, let me get the Huff indexing next to it. So this is one that as we, well, I didn't do something stupid. So here's the initial data. And then here's our, what confidence I want to do. I think I did not say that. All right, so we're going to run this one. So I'm going to close that. These are the ones that I worked on. yesterday afternoon. We finished. So we'll do this one live. So here's our data set. And I want to associate my pattern file. And go to phase, austenite, spherical indexing, go. Should be pretty quick. So again, this is one that, you know, the steps, so you can see these are you know, really deformed structures. So, you know, usually I'd run NPar both before and after to kind of check this to see which one do I like better. NPar's interesting because as you average these patterns, you think that if you're near a grain boundary, it's going to degrade things, but it kind of goes to a weighted average. If you're near a ground boundary and there's 5 patterns on one side and 2 on the other, that averaging will still enhance the 5 more than the 2 and have you more increased signal to work with. So even on like this where the step size and there's a lot of deformation, NPar will often still help to deconvolute the pattern signals and get you better indexing.
Are you able to justify, you know, or say that like it was
so just to only NPar without spherical indexing, like on the hough indexing? Oh, just save the patterns as a saved image. Yes, yeah. So you can run through and save the patterns and then have that exported as a saved pattern set to. That's why you can go and use that reassociate pattern file and say, I want to do it. Yeah, conceivably you could say, I want to do NPar, then do NPar again, and then do NPar again too, to play with that. But yes, you can do that. Yeah. So I'm going to go through and say I want to do one with NPar on. We'll let that run for a minute. So while that's running, any questions? Yes, please. Yeah, so there's a few different formats we're working with. So traditionally, so the question is, what are the file formats I'm working with? So if I'm looking at, I'm going to start with this one. So right now, our data collection program is Apex. So when we save data in Apex, we get this .edax H file format. So that's an HDF file format, container file format that's you know, pretty well documented. They're open. You can see what's in there. You can store multiple data sets in an H5 file. So if I open another instance of OIM and I come open this H5 format, here you'll see there are 3 data sets that are embedded into that. Now, if I only want a single file out of that, I can export these, and it doesn't show. So these are what are called OSC files, which are OIM scan files. That's a binary version of the data set. It's just a single data set. And that's what we used before Apex, which is stored as a single file. We also have, in some cases, what we call the ANG format, which is the angle format, and this is just a text file. So this is open with. I can do this like with Notepad. Hopefully, I can do it with Notepad. This just kind of shows, in the end, you know, here are Euler angles, our XY positions, some of our different metrics. We don't usually work with text files because they're just slower to work with. And then for the pattern files themselves, we have a couple of different options that we use on standard. we have the UP1 or UP2 formats. UP2 is a 16-bit file save. UP1 is a 8-bit file save. So especially when you're, running, I mean, most of the time 8-bit is sufficient, unless you're looking for very fine details and getting really nice patterns. In that case, I'd save them as UP2 if you're concerned about file storage. UP2 is the default, but you can, when we put them on the demo data set, we save them as 8-bit because we're trying to save file space. There are some legacy formats we have. I have like a .pat format. Those can be loaded into OIM Analysis and then exported out as a UP1 or UP2 format. Or if you just have a file with all the TIFFs or JPEGs, can be loaded and then create a UP2 from that. Windows, if you have 1 million files in a folder, Windows generally does not like you. It will struggle. So we like a single pattern file, but we don't like, we have the option to save patterns into an H5 file directly. But if you start having multiple ones of those, they just start to get really large and cumbersome. And sometimes I like, depending on the data set, I like to carry the data set separate than the pattern file. So I have those options of associating a different pattern file and have some flexibility. But those are the main file formats that we use. Does that help? Mm-hmm. So yeah, so when you were going to, if you were to go load an ANG file, so I think it's, which one have it? So like here's an ANG. So you'll notice it loads a lot slower because it's text file. And it does, so it won't automatically associate that, I don't think, with an ASOS with a pattern file. I come here to reindex configuration, associate pattern file. And then I have to go to desktop. And then, this one here would have that pattern file. Then you can see it. Yes, H5 will be that, because that's the program that's output automatically by Apex. Those are already linked by name. It's basically looking at the name to figure out how to do it. So if you came here to your pattern here and changed the name of your pattern file, then it would not be directly linked because it's looking for the same file name between the two. All right, so now let's see how we're. Pretty good timing. All right, so this now, so here's our original data set. So I'm going to create a confidence index partition. And say, let's look at that orientation. Then let's do M1. I'm just going to do it quick with our 2 degrees. Then let's do it with our NPar. And there you see NPar is kind of the secret sauce that extracts it from that TWIP steel to get the data. So that jumps up from 50 something to 90 something in terms of indexing success. So I hope that, so these were all samples and data sets that were submitted by customers. So it's, I hope it gives an idea of the range of improvements and the workflow that you're able to do. It's basically integrated into OIM Analysis. It's just another tool in this very large toolkit that for extracting more from the data you're collecting to try to get the best indexing, really, because once you have this, then the real work starts. Is trying to say, hey, what's deforming? What textures are we getting? What grain sizes? That's what we're really trying to use EBSD for. We're just trying to get the best data possible on as many samples as possible to do subsequent work from that point. I'll check to see if there's any more questions in the chat here. If people are still online. Okay, so a few questions here. One version of OIM 8.1 did not come with NPar. So yeah, NPar is an optional module. It's sometimes bundled with certain detectors and not with others. But certainly, you know, with OIM 9 is released, has both NPar and matrix available. So they are upgradable to that. So here, I'm assuming the question is plasma etching better than chemical etching? And I'm not sure if that means, I'm assuming that's ion etching. So I think the answer is yes, ion etching is better. Chemical etching, you know, you have to, there's a lot of expertise involved in choosing the right reagents and doing it for the appropriate phases. I think that's what it comes down to. And then, you know, certainly between etching or electropolishing, there are some, you know, electropolishing, there's some work to get the parameters right to get a non-pitted surface, you know, a polished surface rather than a strongly etched surface. You know, a lot of chemical etching will introduce some amount of surface topography. And I've shown tools that can address that, but if you can avoid it, I think you're better off. And I think in the end, with ion etching, you have just more control over parameters. Now, with ion etching, you know, sample size is more of an issue, but for most metallographic mounts, 1 1/4 mounts, ion etching is going to do a pretty reasonable job. So there's a question, thank you for running the TWIP, of course, I'm happy to. And then it says, is it possible to export the process styles to a CTF? So we can't export to a CTF, but we can export it to an ANG, to a text format. And from there, you can kind of decide however you want to convert it as an option. So any other questions here in person? No, I would like to, you know, thank you for the time, Dan. Thanks for the invitation and having us for the celebration. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you everyone online.